The room is dim now. Shadows stretch and merge along the walls. Outside, the night hums softly, a distant car, a creak in the floorboards, the quiet sigh of wind pressing its palm against the window. You pull your blanket closer. The air feels cooler than it did a moment ago. Maybe it's just your imagination. Or maybe it's the thought I'm about to plant in your head. See, history isn't always the clean, orderly thing you learned in school. It isn't all dates on chalkboards and stern busts in museums. Sometimes the past hides its teeth not to bite you, but to grin at you slyly from the dark. It drops clues, leaves half-told stories, and then folds the rest away where no one can quite reach. And that's what we're diving into tonight. The places where history refuses to explain itself. Think of the ocean stretching farther than you can see. Somewhere beneath those waves might be the flagship of a vanished emperor, or a sealed jar holding a story no one's read for 2,000 years. Imagine a gold mask in a tomb, the face beneath it lost forever. Or a whole royal bloodline simply melting into the crowd and disappearing like smoke in the wind. You're about to hear about deserts that swallow entire armies, without a trace palaces built for gods that no one can find, libraries that might have contained the cure for every disease you've ever heard of, but now exist only as a faint smell of ash on the breeze. We'll walk down medieval streets and see two children whose skin is the color of new spring leaves. We'll stand on a battlefield, ankle deep in the dust of a legion that Rome itself forgot. And I'll tell you this now, you probably won't survive this. Not in the dramatic sword through the chest way, in the mental way. Because once you start thinking about how much is missing, how much has been deliberately hidden or accidentally lost, you can't stop noticing it. Every museum label becomes suspicious. Every photograph of ruins looks like it's holding back a secret. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. If you're here for quick answers, you won't find them. If you're here for the kind of stories that will unspool in your brain at 3 a.m. while you're staring at the ceiling, welcome home. And one more thing, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I like knowing who else is awake at this hour, listening to the same creak of the universe. Now turn off the lights. Maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started on tonight's journey together. We'll begin with a man who conquered the known world, stood at the edge of another, and then quite literally vanished from the map. The sun in Babylon has a way of turning everything to gold. The walls, the dust, even the air. You'd think it might soften a scene, make it beautiful, but it doesn't. On the day Alexander the Great died, that golden light only made the faces around him look harder, stranger. He was 32, undefeated in battle, ruler of an empire stretching from the mountains of Macedonia to the edges of India. Men like that don't just stop. And yet he did. The records disagree on how. Typhoid, malaria, poison. Some even think it was a slow collapse the combined strain of wounds exhaustion and the kind of alcohol-fueled feasts that would have made your liver start writing angry letters. Whatever the cause, by the time his general stood over him, the man they'd followed through deserts and across oceans was gone. And here's where the story swerves from sad into strange, because according to more than one ancient writer, his body didn't decay. Not for days. That kind of detail made people whisper that maybe Alexander wasn't entirely mortal. In a world where a good rumor could travel faster than a courier, you can imagine how quickly that idea took root. Divine or not, arrangements were made to take him home to Macedon, where the royal tombs of his ancestors waited. Now a funeral for a king like Alexander wasn't a quiet affair. This was no humble bier carried on shoulders. His was a rolling temple, a massive carriage inlaid with gold, drawn by 64 mules, each wearing bells and purple harnesses. It was an announcement on wheels, a moving target, if you like. Enter Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest generals, clever enough to see that in a world where kingdoms were breaking apart, like overbaked bread, possession of the king's body meant possession of something much more valuable: legitimacy. Whoever buried Alexander could claim a direct link to his legacy. And so, somewhere between Babylon and Macedon, Ptolemy intercepted the procession and diverted it to Egypt. First stop, Memphis, the old capital. But at some point, months, maybe years later, Alexander's body was reinterred in the city he himself had founded, Alexandria. A grand tomb was built, a place worthy of pilgrimage. And for centuries it was. Julius Caesar saw it. Augustus paid his respects. Caligula took his breastplate, because of course he did. Then, silence. By the 4th century, the tomb's location was already lost. That's the word a historian named John Chrysostom used. And you have to wonder, how does something like that just vanish? Part of the answer is that Alexandria was a city of layers, built and rebuilt through earthquakes, fires, and invasions. Dynasties rose and fell. Christianity took hold, often erasing physical reminders of the old gods and their mortal favorites. Landmarks disappeared under new streets, new temples, new churches. But the trail doesn't go completely cold. In the early 20th century, construction crews and archaeologists started turning up Hellenistic-era tombs beneath Alexandria's modern neighborhoods. Some researchers think the royal necropolis still lies buried under apartment blocks, perhaps under a mosque or a church, where digging is impossible. Others point to an area near the ancient Soma district, where records say the tomb once stood. And then there are the stranger theories, the kind that make you lean forward a little. A medieval Islamic tradition claims Alexander's body rests in a glass coffin somewhere in the city, hidden from public view. Another says it was spirited away to Constantinople. In Venice, there's a particularly bold suggestion that the body enshrined as Saint Mark in the Basilica is actually Alexander relabeled during the chaos of early Christianity. There's also the buried under the Mediterranean idea, where a seismic event supposedly dropped the tomb into the sea. Or the theory that it's under what's left of the Library of Alexandria. Or, and this one feels almost like a plot from a historical novel, that it was taken east hidden by those who saw Alexander not as a conqueror, but as a demigod. In 1995, a Greek archaeologist claimed to have found the tomb beneath a church. In 2021, another team pointed to a site near Siwa Oasis where Alexander had once consulted the Oracle of Ammon. Neither claim has been proven. Maybe both are wrong. Maybe the tomb is exactly where it's always been, under Alexandria's bustling streets, sealed away by sheer bad luck and the city's stubborn habit of burying its past under its present. And maybe it's gone, desecrated during one of the city's many invasions, the remains scattered. That would be the simplest explanation, though perhaps the hardest to accept. Because the truth is, Alexander's missing tomb isn't just about one man. It's about the allure of something so grand, so historically significant, that the idea of it not existing anymore feels like a hole in the world. If we found it, we'd have answers about his death, about his burial, maybe even about how much of his legend was built after the fact. But we haven't. And every year that passes makes it a little more myth, a little less history, still somewhere out there, maybe under a patch of cracked pavement or a quiet courtyard in Alexandria. There could be a sealed chamber, the air inside untouched for over 2,000 years. And in that chamber, a sarcophagus. Inside, the bones of the man who once wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. Until we find it, if we ever do, the city will keep humming above him, and the mystery will keep whispering beneath our feet. The sea is calm this morning in Alexandria, the kind of stillness that makes the water look more like molten glass than anything alive. But beneath this shimmer is a coastline that has swallowed whole neighborhoods' temples and palaces over the centuries. Somewhere out there, or perhaps directly under the heels of the people walking to work, once stood the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world had ever seen. The Library of Alexandria. It wasn't just a building full of scrolls. It was an idea made stone. Founded in the early 3rd century BC, likely during the reign of Ptolemy II, it was part of the Mouseion, a sanctuary dedicated to the muses goddesses of the arts and sciences. If you imagine it as a dusty warehouse of papyrus, you're thinking too small. This was a complex with lecture halls, gardens, laboratories, and rooms for scholars to live and work in. Think of it as the first research university, with an ambition that feels almost impossible now: to collect every single text ever written. When ships came into Alexandria's harbor, they were searched, not for smuggled goods or contraband for books. Anything written, copied, or inscribed was taken to the library. Original works were kept. Copies were made and given back. The Ptolemies wanted the wisdom of the world in their hands, and they didn't care how aggressive they had to be to get it. By some estimates, the library held between $400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Greek philosophy and tragedy, yes, but also Egyptian religious texts, Mesopotamian epics, astronomical charts from Babylon, medical treatises from India, histories of Carthage, And maybe, if you believe some accounts, maps, and accounts of lands beyond the known world. And then it was gone. No one can agree on the exact moment of death. Plutarch blames Julius Caesar. In 48 BC, Caesar found himself trapped in Alexandria during a campaign and ordered the ships in the harbor set on fire to block enemy advances. The flames spread to the docks, and from there, according to Plutarch, to the library itself. If that's true, imagine thousands of scrolls curling into ash, the words of entire civilizations erased in the space of an afternoon. But other accounts place the destruction later. In the 3rd century, AD civil war broke out in Alexandria during the reign of Emperor Aurelian. Fighting in the royal quarter, where the library likely stood, may have demolished much of it. Still others point to 391 AD, when Theophilus, the Christian patriarch of Alexandria, ordered pagan temples destroyed. The library, with its trove of ancient pagan knowledge, might have been a casualty. And then there's the Arab conquest in the 7th century, when the city fell to the forces of Caliph Umar. A later and probably apocryphal story claims Umar ordered the scrolls burned to heat the city's bathhouses. The truth? It's possible the library didn't die in a single blaze of glory. It may have suffered a slow unraveling, a few thousand scrolls lost here, another thousand there. A shelf of manuscripts eaten by insects, a storage room rotted by damp political neglect, doing what no army could manage in a day. But here's where the mystery sharpens. What if some of it survived? There are whispers, persistent ones, that parts of the collection were moved. Pergamon, Rome, Constantinople desert monasteries. Private collectors and scholars may have squirreled away prized works before the worst came. A legend even speaks of an archive hidden near the Siwa oasis, guarded by the followers of a mystery cult. Others speculate that scrolls traveled farther still to India or China, carried by merchants who valued their contents more than gold. And then, of course, there's the Vatican. The Apostolic Library in Rome is vast and famously secretive. Is it possible that a fraction of Alexandria's treasures ended up there, deliberately hidden away? There's no hard evidence, but the idea persists, perhaps because the thought that they could be somewhere is easier to live with than accepting they're gone forever. Consider what we know we lost. The complete works of Aristotle's dialogues, plays by Sophocles and Euripides that no one has read in 2,000 years. Histories from civilizations we now know only by name. Carthage, the Hittites, entire dynasties of Egypt. Mathematical treatises that might have leapt human understanding forward by centuries. Accounts from Phoenician sailors who may have circled Africa. Competing versions of the Old Testament. And maybe this is where the fringe theories thrive. Records of technologies or maps pointing to places that history insists were unknown. One artifact we do have from ancient Greece gives us a hint of what might have been on those shelves: the Antikythera mechanism. Found in a shipwreck, it's essentially an analog computer from over 2,000 years ago, capable of predicting eclipses and astronomical positions with remarkable precision. If something like that could wash up unexpectedly, imagine what could have been sitting quietly in the library's collection. Here's the thing about the Library of Alexandria. Its absence is louder than its presence ever was. It's the ultimate what if in human history. Would we have discovered antibiotics in the 1st century? Flight in the 10th? Could entire wars have been avoided? Or would we have just made the same mistakes faster, armed with better tools? And yet, the dream refuses to die. Every few years, someone claims to have found a link, a hidden cache, a manuscript that might trace back to Alexandria. So far, nothing definitive. But the possibility is enough to keep people looking. Because if even a handful of those scrolls are still out there untouched by fire or damp or time, they could rewrite what we think we know, not just about history, but about ourselves. So the next time you see an old library, dusty shelves, quiet corners, books with cracked spines, remember that somewhere, on some forgotten day, a scholar in Alexandria unrolled a scroll and read something no human has read since. Maybe they smiled. Maybe they frowned. Maybe they made a note in the margin, never guessing it would be the last note anyone would ever make on that work. And maybe just maybe those words are still waiting somewhere in the dark. The wind off the eastern Mediterranean can be a restless thing. Sometimes warm, sometimes cold, always carrying the smell of salt and the faint bite of seaweed. Picture standing on the deck of a ship in the 12th century BC, the horizon smeared with the outline of unfamiliar coastlines. You're one of the sea peoples, and history hasn't decided yet whether you're a desperate refugee or the villain of the century. That's the problem. We don't actually know who they were. We've given them a name, the Sea Peoples, but that's not what they called themselves. That label comes entirely from Egyptian records carved into stone at temples like Medinet Habu, where Pharaoh Ramses III bragged about how he turned back their fleets. On those walls, you can still see them warriors in feathered or horned helmets, carrying round shields, charging forward from sleek ships with curved prows. It's cinematic stuff. Except in their wake, entire civilizations collapsed. We know this much. Sometime around 1200, 1177 BC, the world of the Late Bronze Age came apart at the seams. The great cities of Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the bustling port of Ugarit in modern-day Syria, they all fell. Trade routes dissolved. Writing systems vanished. Monumental architecture stopped cold. To archaeologists, it's like someone pulled the plug on the ancient Mediterranean. The Egyptians blamed these mysterious mariners. Ramses III. Thur's inscriptions describe how they came from the midst of the sea in a confederation of tribes attacking by both land and water. They hit the Nile Delta, and he claimed to have destroyed them in a decisive battle. But if they were destroyed, it's an odd sort of destruction. They appear, cause chaos across half the known world, and then vanish from history. So who were they? One theory says they were climate refugees. Evidence from ice cores and pollen samples points to a prolonged drought in the eastern Mediterranean around this time. Crops failed. Famine spread. In that context, the Sea Peoples might have been displaced farmers and fishermen, forced to migrate en masse in search of new lands. Others see them as displaced mercenaries, Fighters who had once served in the armies of the great powers now turned against their former employers when the pay stopped coming. If trade collapsed, if palaces could no longer afford foreign troops, those troops might have taken what they were owed by force. Some of the tribal names recorded by the Egyptians seem tantalizingly familiar. The Shurden sound like Sardinia. The Shekelesh could be from Sicily. The Luca might be linked to Lycia in southwestern Anatolia. And the Peliset, many historians connect them to the Philistines, who appear suddenly in the archaeological record of the southern Levant not long after the Sea Peoples' heyday. But there's a big hole in the evidence. The Sea Peoples didn't leave their own written records. Everything we know comes from those who fought them, and victors or survivors tend to write their own spin. Were they an organized invading force? Or a loose wave of migrants moving at the same time for unrelated reasons, lumped together by Egyptian propaganda? The collapse that followed their arrival muddies the waters even further. In Greece, the linear B writing system disappears, ushering in a dark age where records dry up. In Anatolia, the Hittite capital is abandoned, its archives destroyed or lost. In the Levant cities, like Ugarit, show layers of ash and toppled walls. Letters from Ugarit's king plead for aid against enemy ships attacking the coast, but the help never came. And here's the twist. Maybe the Sea Peoples weren't the cause at all. Maybe they were the symptom of something bigger, a perfect storm of drought, famine, earthquakes, and internal rebellions that made the Bronze Age world brittle enough to shatter. In that case, they might have been scapegoats, convenient foreign enemies to blame, while homegrown problems went unaddressed. The more speculative thinkers take this further. They link the Sea Peoples to myths of lost civilizations. Some see echoes of Plato's Atlantis, a seafaring culture displaced by catastrophe. Others note cultural similarities between Philistine pottery and Aegean styles, imagining a mass migration from islands swept by earthquakes or tsunamis. There's even a fringe theory that they were survivors of a Western Mediterranean maritime empire, perhaps based in Sardinia, or the Balearic Islands, that was erased from history when the Bronze Age collapsed. Archaeology has offered a few more solid hints in recent years. Excavations at Philistine sites like Ashkelon and Ekron show an abrupt change in material culture around this period. Houses built in foreign styles, new cooking techniques, and pottery decorated with motifs familiar from the Aegean. DNA studies suggest a genetic influx from southern Europe into the Levant at this time, which fits the migration theory. But the overall picture, still frustratingly blurry. We can map where they may have come from and where they ended up. But the journey in between is full of holes. Imagine this. You're standing on a sun-baked shore in 1177 BC, watching ships gather on the horizon. Some are loaded with warriors, others with families' livestock, and whatever they could salvage from home. They don't think of themselves as sea peoples. They think of themselves as Shurden Shekelesh Peliset, each with their own language and loyalties. They have no idea that centuries later they'll be remembered, if at all, as a faceless force that toppled an age. The waves slap against their ships, and the sails fill with wind. Somewhere inland palaces are crumbling. Trade is drying up, and scribes are sharpening their styluses to write down the story, not of what happened, but of what they want you to believe happened. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Sea People's history, isn't just about what's left behind. It's about who gets to do the telling. The fields around Woolpit, England, in the 12th century would have looked almost storybook to our eyes. Rolling green hills, stitched with hedgerows, a handful of timber-framed houses, clustered around the parish church, and the sound of sheep bells drifting on the wind. But to the people who lived there, this was no fairy tale. It was a working village bound by the rhythms of harvests and the long gray patience of winter. And one afternoon, something entirely out of place stepped into their world. Two children, a boy and a girl, thin, barefoot, and green. Not slightly ill-looking green, green-skinned, as if their bodies had been brushed over with the color of young leaves. Their clothes were equally strange, made of a fabric no one in Woolpit recognized, cut in a style that didn't match any nearby region. The villagers did what villagers do. When confronted with something unusual, they stared. And then slowly they approached. The children didn't speak English. In fact, they spoke a language that no one there had ever heard. When food was offered, they refused everything but raw, broad beans, which they ate hungrily, shells and all. The boy, weaker than his sister, sickened and died soon after. The girl, however, survived. As she adapted to her new life, she began eating other foods, and her skin gradually lost its green tint. She was eventually baptized, and according to chroniclers, learned enough English to explain where she and her brother had come from. And this is where the story tilts from odd to uncanny. She said they came from a place called St. Martin's Land, a sunless world where the light was like twilight, even at midday. Everyone there was green, she claimed, and the land lay just beyond a great river. One day, she and her brother had been herding cattle when they heard a strange sound like bells and followed it into a cave. They wandered in the darkness, and after what must have been hours, emerged into dazzling sunlight and the world of Woolpit. At first glance, you might think folklore, a medieval fable to pass the time by the fire. And that's certainly how it's been treated by many over the centuries. The earliest accounts written by Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh already frame the story with a hint of wonder, noting that they had the tale from trustworthy witnesses. But trustworthy is a flexible word when you're talking about the Middle Ages. So what's the reality here? There are a few grounded theories. One is dietary deficiency, a condition called chlorosis, sometimes called green sickness, can give the skin a faint greenish tinge. It's often linked to malnutrition, particularly iron deficiency, which could also explain the children's initial refusal of unfamiliar foods. The problem with this theory is that chlorosis alone doesn't explain the strange clothing, the language, or the story of a twilight land. Another possibility, arsenic poisoning. In some medieval mining regions, children were put to work in conditions that expose them to arsenic, which can tint the skin and cause weakness. If the children had fled such a place, perhaps from underground mines, their tale of a sunless world might have been a poetic, childlike way of describing their former life. And then there's the migration theory. The 12th century was a time of upheaval and shifting borders. It's possible the children wandered from a Flemish settlement. There were many in eastern England at the time, wearing clothing and speaking a dialect unfamiliar to the people of Woolpit. As for the green skin, again malnutrition could be the culprit. In this version, the cave they spoke of might have been nothing more than a disused mine or chalk pit, the bells perhaps the distant ringing of a church. Still, none of these explanations fits perfectly, which is why the wilder theories persist. Some folklorists connect the tale to myths of the Fae, the Green Children, representing a brief crossing between the human world and that of the fair folk. The imagery of a cave as a passage to another realm appears in countless legends across Europe. Others point to the sunless land as a metaphor for the afterlife, or limbo, making the story a kind of moral allegory. And then there's the speculative fringe, the idea that the children were not from this world at all. The twilight land, the unfamiliar language, the green pigmentation, all reimagined as hints of extraterrestrial origin or even parallel dimensions. A stretch, absolutely. But the human mind has never been good at resisting a mystery with room to grow. What's intriguing is how consistent the story has remained over the centuries. The details vary slightly between chroniclers, but the core two green-skinned children, strange language origin in a sunless world is the same. This consistency suggests that something unusual did happen in Woolpit, even if the truth was more mundane than magic. The girl reportedly grew up in England, eventually working in the household of a knight named Richard de Calne. She was described as very wanton and impudent in adulthood, which might say more about medieval gender norms than her actual character. As for her brother, the boy's early death left his part of the story forever unfinished. If you stand in Woolpit today, the fields roll on just as they did centuries ago. The village has grown, but it's still small enough that everyone knows everyone. Somewhere underfoot, perhaps, are the remains of the paths those children walked the ground where the villagers first saw them and hesitated, unsure if they were dealing with a miracle, a curse, or something stranger still. And here's the thing, the world hasn't gotten less strange since the 12th century. If a child with green skin wandered into your neighborhood tomorrow, speaking an unrecognizable language, we'd have our cameras out in seconds, videos uploaded before anyone asked if they were hungry. We'd have more data, sure, but whether we'd have more answers, that's debatable, because some mysteries, the ones that cling to us across the centuries, work precisely because they never close all the way. The green children of Woolpit didn't just step out of a cave that day. They stepped into the uneasy space between fact and story, where history and legend blur until you can't quite tell them apart. And once you're in that space, you're not entirely sure you want to leave. Picture the northern frontier of Roman Britain around the year 120 AD. The air is sharp, carrying the scent of pine and wet stone. The land is a patchwork of windswept hills and sodden marsh, broken by the dark line of a Roman road slicing northward toward the unknown. Somewhere along that road marched the men of the Ninth Legion, the Legio Ni Hispana, and then, according to history, they vanished. It's the kind of story that clings to the imagination. An entire Roman legion, perhaps 5,000 strong, gone without leaving so much as a helmet behind. But like most great mysteries, the truth is tangled in layers of record-keeping propaganda and the relentless erosion of time. The Ninth Legion had a distinguished history. They fought in Spain and Gaul, and famously under Julius Caesar in the conquest of Britain. By the late 1st century AD, they were stationed at Iberacum, modern-day York, tasked with holding the line against the tribes of the north. The last certain historical mention of them in Britain comes from around 108 AD, when they built new barracks in York. And then the trail fades. One version of the story, the most cinematic, and the one that inspired novels and films, is that the Ninth marched north into Caledonia, Scotland, to quell a rebellion, and never returned, slaughtered to the last man by the fierce Picts, their eagle standard taken as a prize. The image is powerful, a column of men vanishing into the mist, the sound of their armor fading into silence, and nothing but empty moorland to greet the scouts sent to find them. But history is rarely so neat. Inscriptions found in the Netherlands suggest elements of the Ninth may have been stationed there after 120 AD. Some scholars believe the legion wasn't wiped out in Britain at all, but redeployed to the continent where it could have been destroyed in a later conflict, possibly during the Jewish Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea, or in the Eastern Wars against Parthia. If that's true, then the Ninth's mystery is more a case of bureaucratic reshuffling than battlefield tragedy. But it still leaves questions. Why is there no record of their departure from Britain? Why the gap in administrative documents that would have noted such a significant transfer? Then there's the political angle. Losing a full legion to an enemy in Britain would have been a major embarrassment to the empire, especially during a period when Rome was trying to project strength in its farthest provinces. If the Ninth was destroyed in the north, perhaps the official silence was deliberate, a way to avoid emboldening enemies or demoralizing troops. Archaeology offers tantalizing but incomplete hints. In the ruins of Roman forts north of York, there are signs of sudden destruction and abandonment in the early 2nd century. Burn layers shattered weapons coins that stop appearing after a certain date, but these are fragments, not a smoking gun. And then there's the geography. Northern Britain in the 2nd century was a hard-posting, cold, rugged, and full of people who had zero interest in being ruled by Rome. Even the most disciplined troops could find themselves harried, cut off, and ground down over weeks of guerrilla attacks. A legion didn't have to fall in a single pitched battle. It could bleed away cohort by cohort until there was nothing left worth reporting home. The story grew legs in the centuries that followed. By the Middle Ages, the idea of a lost legion in the wilds of Britain had become part of local lore. Later in the 18th and 19th centuries, romanticized histories and adventure novels turned the Ninth's disappearance into a legend of imperial hubris. The might of Rome, humbled by untamed lands and peoples. Some even suggest that survivors of the Ninth might have integrated into local tribes, their descendants living on in the very communities Rome had sent them to subdue. It's unlikely Roman soldiers were not generally welcome defectors, but not impossible in the chaos of a broken campaign. And here's where historians still debate: was the Ninth's fate extraordinary, or was it simply one of many legions that met their end quietly, without the benefit of a chronicler to immortalize them? The Roman army was vast, and while its victories were loudly recorded in stone and marble, its defeats often slipped away into obscurity. Modern interest in the Ninth surged with the discovery of two inscriptions, one from York dating to around 108 AD, and another from Nijmegen in the Netherlands dated a decade or two later. If they refer to the same legion, and most scholars think they do, then the Ninth wasn't lost in Britain after all. Which means the whole Misty Highlands massacre scenario might be more myth than fact. But myths have a way of persisting, especially when they're as haunting as this one. Imagine a line of legionaries marching away from the walls of Eboracum, their red cloaks snapping in the wind. The road stretches out ahead, cutting through heath and forest into the shadow of hills. Somewhere beyond those hills, they meet an end, whether in the heather of Caledonia or the deserts of the East, that will never be written down in full. And in that silence, a story takes root. Even now, standing in the ruins of a Roman fort in northern England, you can almost hear it, the faint clink of armor, the murmur of Latin voices, the thud of boots on packed earth. Then the wind shifts, and the sound is gone, just like the Legion. History might never tell us exactly what happened to the Ninth, but maybe that's why their story endures. It's not just about where they died, it's about the way they disappeared into a gap in the record-leaving room for the imagination to march on without them. The Niger River moves like a living thing, slow and deliberate, in some places quick and eager in others, looping its way through a landscape of green floodplains and dusty gold savannas. In the early 14th century, it was the main artery of one of the wealthiest empires in the world, Mali. The empire's capital, Niani, was a place of palaces, markets heavy with salt and gold, and mosques that shimmered in the heat. And at the very top of it all sat Mansa Abubakari II, until the day he gave it all away for the sea. If you know anything about the Mali Empire, you've probably heard of Mansa Musa Abubakari's younger brother and the man who made headlines across the medieval world with his gold-laden pilgrimage to Mecca. But Musa only took the throne because Abubakari, well, sailed off the map. According to Musa's own account, recorded years later in Cairo, Abubakari had an obsession what lay beyond the western horizon. The Arab world had mapped much of Africa, Europe, and Asia, but the Atlantic Ocean was a great blank. There were whispers of islands out there, maybe even other continents. The Mansa was determined to find out, so he sent an expedition. Not a modest one either. Musa said it was 200 ships each, loaded with supplies water, and enough men to crew them for a long journey. Only one returned. The captain told the Mansa they'd sailed west until they reached a powerful current in the open ocean. The lead ships vanished into it, and he turned back rather than follow them. Now, if you were anyone else, that would have been enough to shelve the project. But Abu Bakr was not anyone else. In 1311, he handed the crown to Musa, outfitted an even larger fleet, $2,000 ships, if the stories are to be believed, and sailed off himself. This time, no one came back. The idea that he might have reached the Americas centuries before Columbus has been irresistible to some historians and a handful of archaeologists. West African currents flow naturally toward the Caribbean and Brazil. Sailors who knew the Niger could have navigated the open ocean, especially if they followed those currents. Add in oral traditions among some Native American communities that speak of visitors arriving in ships made of reeds or carved planks, and the picture gets even more intriguing. There's also the matter of crops. Some botanists have pointed out the presence of African plant species in pre-Columbian South America, like the bottle gourd and certain varieties of yam, though others argue these could have arrived through natural drift or earlier contacts, but there's no hard proof. No West African artifacts have been conclusively dated to pre-Columbian America. The written records of Mali don't go into detail, perhaps because the voyage was considered a failure, or perhaps because if contact was made, it was politically inconvenient to record. After all, Musa's reign became famous in its own right, and Abu Bakr's disappearance became more of a legend than a matter of state. Still, the absence of proof doesn't mean the absence of possibility. The technology was there. Mali's wealth meant they could build large, sturdy ships, not just river canoes, but ocean-worthy vessels. They had knowledge of astronomy and navigation, and they had motivation, the promise of discovery trade, and the glory of being the first to see a new shore. Some fringe theories suggest that traces of West African influence might survive in certain cultural elements of early Caribbean or South American societies, fishing techniques, boat designs, even musical rhythms. These connections are hard to pin down, as cultures have been trading and influencing each other for millennia. But they're enough to keep the speculation alive. Then there's the darker possibility that Abu Bakr's fleet did make landfall and didn't survive. Disease, conflict with local populations, or simply the inability to adapt to an unfamiliar environment could have wiped them out before they could return. The Atlantic is as much a destroyer as it is a bridge. Imagine the scene: a line of ships on the horizon, sails straining against the wind, the smell of salt thick in the air. Weeks have passed since they saw land. The ocean has become a thing, with moods calm one day, furious the next. Supplies are running low. The men whisper about the current, that swallowed the first expedition. And then one morning, a cry from the lookout land. Palm trees, sandy beaches, perhaps the mouth of a wide river spilling fresh water into the sea. They've found it. They beach the ships, take in the strange birds, the unfamiliar trees. They wonder how far they've come from home and whether they will ever see it again. And in that moment, history pivots. If they survive, if they build a camp, if they make friends instead of enemies, the story of Atlantic exploration changes forever. But if they vanish, swallowed by the ocean, the land, or the silence of time, it becomes just another question mark, drifting out there on the waves. Back in Mali, life went on. Musa ruled, and his pilgrimage to Mecca made him a legend. Abu Bakari's voyage became a fireside story part, warning part, inspiration. The ocean was still there, still blank on the maps, still whispering. And maybe that's the true heart of the mystery. It's not just about whether he reached the Americas. It's about a ruler who had everything and still chose to walk away from it for a horizon he couldn't see past. Most kings spend their lives guarding their thrones. Abu Bakari left his behind in search of something bigger. We'll never know if he found it. The Egyptian desert doesn't care about your plans. You can march into it with 50,000 men fully armed, fully supplied, and it will still decide whether you leave again. That's the lesson buried somewhere in the story of Cambyses II's lost Persian army, a tale that's been drifting in the sands for over 2.5 millennia. Cambyses was the son of Cyrus the Great, heir to the vast Achaemenid Empire. By 525 BC, he'd already conquered Egypt, defeating Pharaoh Psamtik III and taking control of the Nile Valley. But conquering Egypt wasn't enough. Cambyses wanted to consolidate his power, stamp out resistance, and if the Greek historian Herodotus is to be believed, humiliate a rival oracle. The target was the Siwa Oasis, hundreds of miles west of the Nile Delta. There, in a temple surrounded by palms and springs, sat the oracle of Ammon, a god the Greeks associated with Zeus. For Cambyses, the idea that this oracle might recognize someone else's authority, perhaps a rebellious Egyptian faction, was intolerable. So he ordered a detachment of 50,000 men to march across the desert, crush any opposition, and if possible, bring the oracle to heel. According to Herodotus, the army set out from Thebes and made it as far as the oasis of Karga, where they rested and replenished their supplies. From there, they plunged into the Great Sand Sea, an expanse of shifting dunes and endless horizon. Then, nothing. Herodotus says that after several days, a massive sandstorm rolled in, burying the army alive. Not a single man returned. It's a dramatic image. The wind howling the sky, turning the color of rust walls, of sand swallowing soldiers and pack animals in minutes. But like most ancient stories, it leaves us with more questions than answers. First, the logistics. Moving an army of that size across the desert would have been a staggering undertaking. Even with water skins, camels, and caches along the route, survival would have depended on precise timing and weather conditions. A sudden sandstorm could have been catastrophic. But could it really erase 50,000 people without leaving a trace? Second, the sources. Herodotus was writing decades after the event, relying on second-hand accounts. Egyptian records are silent on the matter. It's possible the army never reached Siwa for reasons more mundane: mutiny, disease, starvation, or defeat at the hands of hostile tribes in the western desert. The sandstorm could be a later embellishment, a way to explain the disappearance in a single memorable stroke. Modern explorers have tried to solve the riddle. In the 1990s, twin Italian archaeologists, Angelo and Alfredo Castiglione, claimed to have found evidence of the lost army near the Gilf Kebir Plateau. Fragments of weapons, bits of metal, even a burial site containing human remains. But their findings were met with skepticism, partly because the location was far south of the supposed route to Siwa. Other expeditions have scoured the desert with ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery, looking for signs of mass graves or buried artifacts. The problem is that the desert is a restless archivist. Sand shifts, dunes migrate. What might have been visible a decade ago can vanish under meters of wind-blown sediment. And even if remains are found proving they belong to Cambyses' army, rather than to any number of other travelers, traders, or soldiers, is another challenge entirely. Some historians have floated alternative theories. One suggests the army never intended to attack the oracle at all, but was instead sent to secure trade routes or suppress unrest among Libyan tribes allied with Egypt. If that's the case, they could have been ambushed, their supplies seized, forcing them to scatter and die in the desert. Another posits that they were caught in a seasonal Qumran wind, a hot, dry, suffocating blast from the south that can reach hurricane force and strip the moisture from your body faster than thirst alone. There's also the possibility that Herodotus's account was part of Persian-Egyptian propaganda. Cambyses had a reputation for cruelty and erratic behavior in some Greek and Egyptian sources. Tales of him desecrating temples, stabbing the sacred Apis bull, and executing rivals in fits of rage. Whether or not these stories were true, they painted him as a cautionary figure, a king whose arrogance led him to send an army into the desert without respecting its dangers. In that light, the lost army becomes more moral parable than historical report. Still, the image of an entire force disappearing into the sands has a grip on the imagination. The desert, for all its emptiness, is full of ghosts. If you stand at the edge of the Great Sand Sea today, the dunes stretch away in all directions like frozen waves. The heat presses against you. Your skin dries almost instantly, and you can picture it: ranks of soldiers trudging forward, their sandals filling with grit, the horizon wobbling in the heat haze. A distant roar is it wind, or something else swells into a deafening wall of sound. Visibility drops to nothing. Men shout, but their voices are snatched away. The world becomes sand, and then there is no world at all. If the army is still out there, it sleeps beneath a shifting graveyard armor and bones locked away in layers of desert that haven't seen sunlight in thousands of years. Maybe someday, a dune will move just enough to reveal a glint of bronze, the curve of a helmet, a fragment of a spear. Or maybe the desert will keep its secret, and Cambyses' lost army will remain one of history's great vanishing acts, a story told around campfires, its truth buried under as many layers as the sands themselves. Because that's the thing about deserts. They don't just erase footprints, they erase answers. Imagine holding a book in your hands that no one alive has ever seen. Not because it's locked away in a vault or hidden in a private collection, but because it might not even exist anymore if it ever did. That's the puzzle of the Gospel of Q, one of Christianity's most enduring textual mysteries. To understand why it matters, you have to picture the world of the early followers of Jesus in the decades right after his death. The stories of his life, his sayings, and his teachings weren't written down immediately. They were passed along in marketplaces, whispered in gatherings, preached in synagogues and homes. These were oral traditions, vivid, memorable, but always at risk of changing with each retelling. Eventually, the first written accounts began to take shape. The Gospel of Mark appeared first probably around 70 AD. Then came Matthew and Luke, and that's where things get interesting. When scholars compare these texts, they notice something strange. Matthew and Luke share entire passages that are not in Mark. Word for word sometimes. It's as if they both had access to another source, one we no longer have. That hypothetical source is what scholars call Q. The name comes from the German word Quell, meaning source. It's not a physical manuscript anyone's found. It's a reconstruction, an educated guess based on the overlaps between Matthew and Luke. If Q existed, it would have been a collection of Jesus' sayings and teachings, something like a quote book, without the narrative elements you see in the other Gospels. No birth story, no miracles, no passion narrative, just the words themselves, parables, blessings, warnings. In a way, it might be the closest thing we'd ever get to hearing Jesus' voice without the interpretive framing of later authors. The debate over Q has been going on for more than a century. Some scholars argue that Matthew and Luke could have simply copied from each other or from a shared oral tradition without a written Q. Others say the precision of the shared passages, the way they match in both Greek vocabulary and sequence, makes a written source far more likely. And here's where it gets tantalizing. If Q existed, where is it now? One possibility is that it was never meant to be a finished book. In the early church, texts were copied by hand, and copies wore out, or were replaced by newer, more comprehensive gospels. Q may have been folded into other writings, its standalone scroll eventually discarded. Early Christians didn't necessarily think in terms of preserving every document. They were focused on spreading the message, not archiving it. Another possibility is that Q didn't survive because it didn't fit the developing narrative of the church. If it lacked stories about the crucifixion and resurrection central elements of Christian faith, later leaders might have seen it as incomplete or even dangerous, quietly letting it fall out of circulation. There's also the wild card theory that Q still exists somewhere misidentified in a library or hidden in a monastery collection, waiting for the right person to recognize it. This isn't entirely far-fetched. Lost Gospels and ancient texts have turned up in unlikely places. Before the Gospel of Thomas, for example, was found in a jar in Egypt in 1945, after being buried for over 2,500 years. If Q were found, it could reshape our understanding of early Christianity. The Jesus of Q, reconstructed from the shared sayings, is often presented as more of a wisdom teacher than a miracle-working Messiah, a figure focused on ethics, humility, and the reversal of social order. That doesn't necessarily contradict the Jesus of the canonical Gospels, but it does shift the emphasis. Of course, the absence of a physical Q has given rise to other possibilities. Some scholars suggest that the overlaps between Matthew and Luke might be the result of a floating oral tradition that was so stable in its phrasing that it functioned like a text even if no one wrote it down. In that case, Q wouldn't be a lost document, it would be a lost pattern of speech, preserved only in the way those two writers happened to capture it. But here's the thing. Whether Q existed or not, its ghost shapes the way we read the Gospels today. Every time a Bible scholar lines up passages from Matthew and Luke side by side, they're peering into a shadow, the outline of something that might once have been ink on papyrus, copied and carried by hand across the ancient world, and then allowed to slip away. Picture it, a scribe in Antioch or Galilee unrolling a scroll filled with terse, powerful lines. He dips his pen, makes a copy, and passes it along to another believer heading for Corinth or Rome or Alexandria. The scroll is read memorized and worn thin. Years later, it's no longer needed. Other texts have taken its place. The papyrus is repurposed, scraped clean, or simply discarded. Wind and dust finish the job. The teachings survive woven into other works, but the original source is gone. Or maybe it's not gone at all. Somewhere in a dark storeroom, in a monastery, high in the mountains of Ethiopia, or hidden deep in the archives of the Vatican, there could be a brittle roll of papyrus that begins with a simple line. These are the sayings. If that day ever comes, it won't just be a headline for religious scholars. It'll be a jolt to anyone who's ever wondered how much of history is built on things we assume once existed without ever having seen them. Q is more than a missing book. It's a reminder that the story we tell about the past is only as complete as the fragments we can hold on to. And the rest, that's left to faith in every sense of the word. You can almost hear it, the low hum of a lyre, the rhythmic stamping of feet on packed earth, the rise and fall of a voice carrying words older than the walls they echo off. The poet's eyes are half closed, not because he's lost his place, but because he's never needed to look at the words. They live in him, spilling out in measured lines, each one part of a pattern he's walked 1,000 times before. And somewhere in that sound is the Iliad. Though in this moment, there's no parchment, no ink, no author. The way we understand it today, that's the heart of the Homeric question, who wrote the Iliad? Or, perhaps more accurately, did anyone? We call it Homer's Iliad. And for centuries, Western tradition has pictured Homer as a blind bard wandering from town to town reciting the epic from memory. But here's where the mystery starts to ripple for something so long and so intricate. 15,693 lines in its surviving form. Could one man really have composed it entirely in his head? And if he did, how did it remain so consistent in a time when stories were passed down, orally, changing with each telling? Some scholars argue that Homer was indeed a real person, perhaps a court poet or a respected elder in a community of performers who crafted a definitive version of the Iliad sometime in the 8th century BC. In this view, he's a historical figure, even if the details of his life have been lost. Others see Homer not as an individual, but as a collective, a name that represents generations of oral poets who shaped and reshaped the story over centuries. In this model, the Iliad isn't the work of a single hand, but the culmination of a long tradition, finally written down only when the Greek world shifted toward literacy. The poem itself gives us clues and contradictions. Its language is a blend of dialects from different Greek regions, suggesting it wasn't composed in a single place or time. Certain passages feel older, rooted in the Mycenaean world of 1200 BC, while others reflect the social realities of later centuries. It's as if someone stitched together fragments from different eras into one seamless cloth. And then there's the oral formulaic theory, pioneered by scholars in the 20th century. By studying living traditions of oral poetry in places like the Balkans, researchers noticed something familiar. Bards there used repeated phrases, stock epithets, and set-piece scenes to build long narratives on the fly. Swift-footed Achilles, rosy-fingered Dawn. These aren't just poetic flourishes. They're memory anchors, rhythmic placeholders that help a poet keep the meter and recall the story. If that's how the Iliad was composed, then Homer, or the Homeric poets, might not have memorized the whole thing word for word, but rather rebuilt it from a familiar structure each time, like a jazz musician riffing on a theme. But if it was an oral tradition, who decided on the version we have now? The usual suspect is Pisistratus, the tyrant of Athens in the 6th century BC. Some ancient sources claim he ordered the Iliad and Odyssey to be written down and standardized for performance at the Panathenaic festival. If true, that would mean the text we know is the product of an editorial process, freezing one version of a fluid evolving story. The Homer we think we know could be as much a political creation as a poetic one. Of course, there are the more romantic theories. One holds that Homer was indeed a blind poet from the island of Chios, drawing on centuries-old tales of the Trojan War, stitching them together into a masterpiece. Another suggests he traveled widely, absorbing stories from different regions and wove them into a single epic tapestry. Some even speculate there were two Homers, one for the Iliad, another for the Odyssey. Their works later bound together by tradition. Then there's the archaeological angle. In the late 19th century, Heinrich Schliemann excavated a site in modern-day Turkey he believed to be Troy, finding evidence of a great city destroyed by war around 1200 BC. While Schliemann's methods were, let's say, enthusiastic and sometimes destructive, his work did prove there was a Troy, and that it had been violently destroyed more than once. That doesn't mean the Iliad is historical reportage. but it does suggest the poem was rooted in real events, memories of a war passed down for centuries before anyone wrote them down. And maybe that's part of why the authorship question is so slippery. The Iliad lives in two worlds, at once the historical and the mythic. The poet, whoever he was, doesn't just record facts, he shapes them, polishing them until they gleam like the bronze armor of Achilles himself. When you listen to the poem, really listen, it almost doesn't matter if it came from one voice or 1,000. The rhythm carries you along. The battles roar. The grief cuts deep. Homer becomes less a man and more a vessel, the point where countless storytellers' voices converge. Still, there's a certain magic in imagining him as a single figure. Picture it, an old man seated on a low stool, his sight long gone, but his mind alight fingers, plucking the strings of a lyre. Around him, a crowd leans in. The fire crackles. Outside, the Aegean wind rattles the shutters. And in that warm, flickering space, the walls fall away, and you're on the plains of Troy, hearing the tramp of feet and the clash of shields. Who was he? Maybe we'll never know. But the fact that the question still matters 28 centuries later says something about the way we hunger to connect the art to the artist. We want to see the hand behind the brushstroke, the face behind the voice. And sometimes, when history won't give it to us, we fill in the blanks ourselves. In the end, whether Homer was one man, many men, or even partly a woman, some have argued for female contributors to early Greek epic, the Iliad, survives as a bridge across time. Its author might be lost in the mists of history, but his or their words are still here, still alive, still reminding us that some stories don't need a name to endure. And maybe that's the answer to the Homeric question, the real author of the Iliad. Is everyone who ever told it. The Valley of the Kings is a place where the air feels heavier, as though it's weighed down by the secrets underfoot. The limestone cliffs rise in jagged walls, their shadows sharp in the Egyptian sun, and every step crunches over ground that has covered pharaohs for more than 3,000 years. Somewhere here, or perhaps somewhere entirely different, many believe the most famous queen of ancient Egypt still lies waiting, Nefertiti. She was more than just the face on that iconic bust in Berlin, the one with the perfectly arched brows and the faint, unreadable smile. Nefertiti was a power in her own right, queen co-ruler, and possibly pharaoh in the final years of Egypt's most radical era. She and her husband Akhenaten upended centuries of tradition, abandoning the old gods in favor of a single deity, the sun disk Aten. Together, they built a new capital, Akhetaten, and reshaped the art, religion, and politics of Egypt in ways that still puzzle historians. And then she vanished. The records, after year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, go silent on her. Some suggest she died suddenly, perhaps from plague or illness. Others believe she took on a new name and identity, possibly ruling as the mysterious Pharaoh Neferneferuaten, or even as Smenkhkare, a short-lived ruler who bridged the gap between Akhenaten and the boy king Tutankhamun. If true, Nefertiti wouldn't have disappeared at all. She would have slipped into another role, masking her identity behind the trappings of kingship. The location of her tomb has been one of archaeology's great obsessions. For decades, the prevailing theory was that she must be buried in Amarna, the city she and Akhenaten built. But Amarna's royal tombs have been heavily looted since antiquity, and no definitive trace of her has been found there. In the 21st century, a new idea took hold. What if she's in the Valley of the Kings, hidden in plain sight? In 2015, British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves announced that high-resolution scans of Tutankhamun's tomb walls suggested the presence of hidden doorways, possibly leading to a larger connected burial chamber. Reeves theorized that Tutankhamun's tomb was originally meant for Nefertiti, and when the boy king died unexpectedly, he was placed in an outer chamber with the queen's untouched burial still sealed beyond. It was a theory worthy of headlines and, of course, intense debate. Ground-penetrating radar surveys were conducted with conflicting results. One scan seemed to show voids behind the walls. Another showed nothing of significance. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, wary of damaging one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world, has hesitated to authorize invasive exploration. If Reeves is right, it would solve several mysteries at once: why Tutankhamun's tomb is smaller than expected for a king, why its layout is unusual, and why some of its wall paintings may depict a female figure performing funerary rites. But without physical excavation, the idea remains in limbo. Other researchers have proposed more distant burial sites. The Wadi Abad near Amarna has yielded some evidence of royal activity, as has the desert area near the village of Deir el-Bersha. There's also speculation about tombs yet undiscovered in the Valley of the Queens, or even in the cliffs west of the Valley of the Kings, where radar has detected multiple unexplored cavities. And then there are the more fantastical suggestions that Nefertiti's remains were removed in antiquity and reburied elsewhere to protect them, or that her body, like some royal mummies, was deliberately destroyed to erase her legacy. The political backlash after Akhenaten's death was fierce. The restoration of the old gods meant a deliberate effort to erase the Amarna period from history. If Nefertiti was seen as the architect of that heresy, her tomb might have been a target. Yet oddly enough, her image survived, or at least one image did. The bust discovered in 1912 now in Berlin's Neues Museum is one of the most recognizable artifacts in the world. Its survival, while her actual resting place remains hidden, feels almost like a cosmic joke. We can see her face in perfect detail, but we cannot find her bones. Imagine what her tomb, if found intact, could tell us. The grave goods, the inscriptions, the style of her burial, all could shed light on the end of her life, the nature of her rule, and the true power she wielded. And beyond history, there's the sheer human thrill of standing in a chamber where no one has stood for over 3,000 years. The air still carrying the faint smell of ancient resin and linen. The search for Nefertiti isn't just about archaeology. It's about the allure of an unfinished story. She steps onto the stage of history in vivid color, a queen beside her king, radiant, commanding, possibly even ruling Egypt herself, and then walks off into the wings without a final act. Somewhere under tons of rock and sand, that act might still be waiting. And maybe one day, a team with the right tools and the right political permission will break through a sealed wall or clear a forgotten shaft and find her surrounded by the treasures of the Amarna court. Until then, the valley keeps its secrets. The cliffs glare in the midday sun, the tombs sleep in their darkness, and Nefertiti remains both the most famous face in Egypt and its most elusive ghost. If you walk through Hamelin today, the real one in Lower Saxony, Germany, you'll find cobblestone streets and timber-framed houses that look like they've been lifted straight from a medieval illustration. There's a clock tower that chimes on the hour, and on certain days, a mechanical display reenacts the town's most famous story. Children lean forward, waiting for the doors to open and the little carved figures to march out. It's a charming scene until you remember that the story it tells is about children disappearing. The earliest records of the event are sparse, almost maddeningly so. A stained glass window in Hamelin's church, dating to around 1300, now lost but described in later accounts, depicted a figure in bright clothing, leading a group of children away. An inscription from the same period read simply, "In the year of 1284, on the day of Saints John and Paul, 130 children of Hamelin were led away by a piper and were lost." No mention of rats, no magical music, just the stark fact the children were gone. By the 16th century, the story had already begun to shift. The piper had become the Pied Piper, named for his multicolored clothing, and his motive, at least in the popular telling, was revenge. In this later version, the townspeople had hired him to rid Hamelin of a plague of rats, then refused to pay. The piper retaliated by playing his flute and leading their children away. Some say they were drowned in the river Weser. Others say they vanished into a cave or a hill. It's a story that sounds like a fairy tale, and indeed, it was immortalized by the Brothers Grimm and by Robert Browning's 19th century poem. But peel back the embellishments, and you're left with a chilling historical question: what actually happened in Hamelin in 1284? One theory is migration. In the Middle Ages, it wasn't uncommon for groups of young people to be recruited to settle new lands in Eastern Europe, often in areas depopulated by war or plague. A piper in this context could have been a recruiter, someone whose colorful clothing and persuasive speech drew children or young adults to leave their homes. Over time, the memory of voluntary migration could have morphed into the darker legend of abduction. Another theory points to disease. Some suggest the loss of the children was due to an outbreak of plague or another epidemic. The piper, in this version, is symbolic, a personification of death, much like the skeletal figures in medieval danse macabre art. The bright clothing might reflect the jester-like costumes often used in depictions of death, at the time intended to remind viewers that death comes for everyone no matter their station. There's also the possibility of a local disaster, a landslide, a flood, or an accident that claimed many young lives at once. In a world without modern rescue or forensic investigation, such an event could easily become a story of vanishing, especially if the bodies were never recovered. And yes, There are the more speculative ideas. Some link the Hamelin event to the Children's Crusade of 1212, when large numbers of children and adolescents were said to have set out for the Holy Land, many never to return. The dates don't line up perfectly, but the thematic parallels children lured away on a grand, ill-fated journey are striking. Others whisper about mass poisoning, possibly from ergot fungus on rye bread, which can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Then there's the odd detail about the cave or hill. In several versions of the tale, the children follow the piper into a mountain which closes behind them. This could be a metaphor for death, a folk memory of an earthquake or landslide, or if you're inclined toward folklore, an echo of older European myths about humans being lured into the realm of the fair folk never to return. What's particularly strange is how Hamelin itself has treated the story over the centuries. The town seems to have regarded it as historical fact, at least in its earliest form. Official records from the 14th and 15th centuries reference the loss of the children as a real event, not as a parable. Even today, certain streets in Hamelin avoid playing music in quiet acknowledgement of the legend. Imagine the scene as it might have been in 1284, a summer's day. The townspeople busy at their trades. Then a figure appears, bright clothing catching the sun music floating on the air. The children, curious, follow. Maybe the adults don't notice right away, or maybe they do, but assume the children will come back. Hours pass. Evening falls. No one returns. The search begins spreading from house to house, then out into the fields, then into the forests and hills beyond. And still nothing. If the piper was a real person, he left no name behind, just the image of a man whose music could part children from their parents forever. If he was a metaphor, he's one that still works centuries later, because the idea of losing all the children in a community in one moment is almost too big to imagine. It's the kind of loss that demands a story to hold it. And maybe that's why the tale has endured changing shape to fit the fears of each generation. In one era, it's about broken promises and revenge. In another, it's about disease and death. In ours, it might read as a cautionary tale about trust and vulnerability. But under every version lies the same unanswerable question. Where did the children go? Walk those streets today, and you might hear the sound of tour guides telling the story, their voices animated for the benefit of visiting families. But if you stay after dark, when the crowds have gone, Hamelin's narrow lanes grow very quiet. The Weser flows past in its slow, steady way. And if you listen hard enough, you might imagine a faint, distant music just beyond the edge of hearing the kind that makes you want to follow without knowing why. If you follow the road south from Jerusalem toward the Dead Sea, the hills begin to fall away into a landscape that feels older than time itself. Bare rock, sun-bleached cliffs, and a silence so deep you can almost hear your own heartbeat. Somewhere in this desolate terrain, in the late 1940s, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ed-Dib tossed a stone into a cave and heard the sound of pottery breaking. That was the first crack in the door to one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Inside that cave, now known as Cave 1 at Qumran, were large clay jars, and inside them, tightly rolled scrolls of parchment and papyrus wrapped in linen. They were fragile, darkened with age, and written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. That first hall contained some of the oldest surviving copies of biblical texts ever found, dating back over 2,000 years. In the years that followed, archaeologists and locals scoured the cliffs and wadis of the region, eventually uncovering fragments from 11 different caves. The total came to around 900 manuscripts, some almost complete, others just scraps. They included not only books from the Hebrew Bible, but also commentaries, community rules, apocalyptic visions, hymns, and texts that had never been seen before. Here's where the mystery begins. Who wrote them? And why were they hidden? The prevailing theory links the scrolls to a Jewish sect known as the Essenes. According to the historian Josephus, the Essenes lived in strict monastic-like communities, practicing ritual purity and awaiting the coming of two messiahs, one priestly, one kingly. The settlement at Qumran, with its water channels and communal dining hall, fits this description well. In this view, the scrolls were the Essenes library hidden in caves for safekeeping during the Jewish revolt against Rome in 66-73 AD, just before the Roman legions destroyed the region. But not everyone agrees. Some scholars argue that the scrolls were not written at Qumran at all, but were brought there from Jerusalem's temple library as the city prepared for siege. Others see Qumran not as a monastic center, but as a fortress, a pottery production site, or even a winter palace. In these versions, the scrolls could have come from multiple sources, perhaps even different sects with competing beliefs. Then there's the question of what's missing. The scrolls were found in pieces, often damaged by time, water, or human handling. We have tantalizing glimpses of works that are otherwise lost. A book of giants, featuring the offspring of angels and humans, for example, or alternate versions of biblical books that differ significantly from the standardized texts used today. What else might have been in those jars, now turned to dust? The secrecy surrounding the scrolls after their discovery only deepened the mystery. For decades, access to many of them was restricted to a small team of scholars, leading to accusations of academic hoarding and even conspiracy. It wasn't until the 1990s that most of the scrolls were published and made available to the wider world, revealing a complex and often surprising portrait of Second Temple Judaism. Some of the surprises were theological. The scrolls show that Jewish belief at the time was far from monolithic. There were competing interpretations of law, prophecy, and purity. Some texts describe an imminent end of days, with cosmic battles between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. Others focus on meticulous community rules, down to how to eat bread or handle ritual baths. Then there are the texts that sound eerily familiar to Christian ears. The teacher of righteousness, a central figure in some scrolls, is described as a divinely inspired leader persecuted by corrupt priests. While most scholars stop short of drawing direct lines between him and Jesus, the parallels have fueled endless speculation. Were early Christian ideas shaped directly or indirectly by the beliefs preserved in these caves? And what about the scrolls that still haven't been found? Ancient libraries rarely contain just one copy of important works. If some scrolls made it into caves, might others still lie undiscovered, buried under centuries of rockfall or sand? Every so often, rumors emerge of fragments turning up on the antiquities market, some genuine, some forgeries. In recent years, even museums have had to admit that prized Dead Sea Scroll fragments they purchased were modern fakes painted onto ancient-looking leather. It's tempting to imagine that somewhere out there is a complete intact scroll, maybe in a still-sealed jar in an unentered cave, that could rewrite part of what we know about biblical history. Or perhaps the real treasure is not a single text, but the cumulative picture. They paint a vibrant, diverse religious landscape full of debate, expectation, and human striving. Think about that shepherd in 1947, standing at the cave mouth, holding a scroll he didn't yet realize was older than the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. He couldn't have known that his casual throw of a stone would send shockwaves through archaeology, theology, and history. The caves at Qumran are quiet now, their entrances weathered and pale against the cliffs. But if you stand there in the heat, the wind carrying the smell of salt from the Dead Sea, it's easy to picture the urgency of those who once scrambled to hide their most precious writings from approaching danger. They could not have imagined that 2,000 years later, strangers from all over the world would be poring over their words, trying to piece together who they were and what they believed. And maybe that's the final mystery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, not just the texts themselves, but the way they've outlived the people who wrote them, the empire that destroyed them, and the centuries of silence that followed a whisper from the desert that refuses to be lost. The jungle along the Yucatan Peninsula doesn't part easily. The air is thick with humidity, the ground soft with centuries of fallen leaves, and the sound of insects hums so constantly it becomes a kind of pressure on your ears. Somewhere, under that green canopy, hidden beneath mounds that look like nothing more than overgrown hills, lie the bones of cities that once thrived with tens of thousands of people. And in the heart of that lost world, archaeologists have found something they still can't fully explain: the sudden, mysterious collapse of the Maya civilization. When you hear collapse, it's easy to imagine an instant catastrophe, a single apocalyptic day when the temples crumbled and the people vanished. The truth is, slower, stranger, and in some ways, more haunting. Between about 750 and 900 AD, the great Maya cities of the southern lowlands, places like Tikal and Palenque, began to be abandoned. Monuments stopped being erected. Carvings and stelae recording royal events went silent. Trade routes shrank. By the time Europeans arrived centuries later, the jungle had reclaimed much of what the Maya had built. The big question is, why? Theories abound, each with evidence to back it up, and each with gaps big enough to drive a stone pyramid through. One of the most widely accepted explanations is environmental collapse. Sediment cores from lakes in the region, show clear signs of prolonged droughts during the late 8th and 9th centuries. Without enough rainfall, maize crops would have failed, reservoirs would have dried, and populations would have suffered famine. Compounding that the Maya were masters of agriculture, but their methods weren't always sustainable. Large-scale slash-and-burn farming and the expansion of urban centers may have stripped the land of nutrients, leading to soil exhaustion. As food production faltered, so did the ability of rulers to feed their people and maintain political control. But drought and agriculture alone don't tell the whole story. There's strong evidence of internal warfare intensifying in the final centuries before the collapse. Fortifications appear around cities that previously had none, and inscriptions from this period speak more often of captives' raids and bloody victories. Political fragmentation may have turned the great network of Maya city-states against one another, making it harder to respond to environmental stress. There's also the social angle. The Maya elite poured immense resources into monumental building and elaborate ceremonies, even as ordinary people bore the brunt of food shortages and instability. Some scholars suggest that disillusionment with the ruling class could have led to a loss of faith in the divine right of kings, and without that belief, the whole political religious structure could crumble. Then there's the possibility of disease. Although there's little direct evidence, epidemics could have swept through dense urban populations weakened by hunger, further accelerating depopulation. If you combine all these factors, environmental disaster, political infighting, social upheaval, and possible disease, you get a perfect storm scenario for collapse. And yet, the Maya didn't vanish. That's one of the biggest misconceptions about the so-called mystery. Millions of Maya people are alive today, speaking Maya languages, practicing traditions that stretch back hundreds of years. What collapsed was not the people, but their political and urban system in the southern lowlands. In the northern Yucatan cities, like Chichen Itza and Mayapan, continued to flourish for centuries after the southern capitals fell silent. Still, the abruptness of the decline in the south is striking. Imagine being a citizen of Tikal in the year 800 AD. Your city has stood for centuries with towering pyramids and bustling markets. The king presides over rituals to honor the gods. The calendar marks the cycles of time, and the jungle beyond the walls is kept at bay. Then year by year, the rains grow unreliable. Crops fail. War bands from rival cities attack the outskirts. Taxes rise, but the temples still demand their offerings. You hear whispers that the gods are angry, that the king's power is fading. And one day, you pack up what you can carry and leave. Maybe you head for a smaller, more defensible settlement. Maybe you join a caravan heading north. Either way, the city you once knew begins to dissolve back into the green. Modern technology has only deepened the mystery. In recent years, Lidar light detection and ranging scanning from aircraft has revealed entire networks of roads, reservoirs, and urban complexes hidden beneath the jungle canopy. These findings show that Maya civilization was even more extensive and interconnected than we realized. That makes the collapse even more puzzling. How could such a sophisticated system, with advanced water management and long-distance trade, unravel so completely in some regions? Some researchers now think the very complexity of the system was its weakness. The more interconnected the cities were, the more vulnerable they became to cascading failures. A drought in one region could disrupt trade networks, leading to shortages in another, sparking conflict that spread instability across the whole system. And then there's the outside contact theory fringe, but persistent. A few have speculated about disruptions caused by contact with foreign groups, perhaps through early seaborne trade, or even more exotic scenarios involving Old World influence. There's no solid evidence for this, but it reflects the human tendency to search for a singular dramatic cause rather than the messy web of factors history often gives us. Walking through the ruins today, you feel the weight of that web. The temples rise above you like stone mountains, their steps steep and narrow. Carvings of kings and gods stare down their features, softened by centuries of rain. Trees grow through what were once palaces. Vines curl over the stones of marketplaces that once rang with voices. The jungle has taken back everything, but the air still feels charged, as if the city is only sleeping. The Maya collapse is a reminder that civilizations are not immortal. They are intricate balances of environment, economy, politics, and belief balances that can tip faster than anyone expects. And perhaps the real lesson is that collapse is not the end of a people, only the end of a particular way of living. The Maya adapted, survived, and endure. But the mystery of why their great cities fell silent still calls to us from under the roots and the leaves. Somewhere in those ruins, in an as yet unexcavated chamber or an unstudied glyph, there may be a clearer answer. Until then, the jungle keeps its counsel, and we keep walking the raised causeways, imagining the sound of feet on stone, the call of vendors in the market, and the sudden heavy silence that came after. High in the Peruvian Andes, nearly 8,000 feet above sea level, a city of perfect stonework perches like a dream made solid. The morning mist clings to its terraces, curling around walls that have stood for centuries without mortar. Their stones fitted so precisely you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. This is Machu Picchu, one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world, and yet for all the photographs and postcards, it still guards its greatest secret, why it was built at all. We know some things with certainty. Machu Picchu was constructed in the mid-15th century during the reign of the Inca Emperor Pachacuti. Its location is spectacular, but precarious, a ridge between two mountain peaks with sheer drops into the Urubamba River Valley on either side. It was never a sprawling city like Cusco, but it contained over 150 structures, temples, residences, storehouses, fountains, and terraces carved into the mountainside for agriculture. What we don't know, despite a century of excavation, is its purpose. Hiram Bingham, the American explorer who made the site famous in 1911, believed it was the last refuge of the Inca nobility after the Spanish conquest, a hidden stronghold where they fled to escape the invaders. It was a dramatic story, but evidence later showed Machu Picchu had been abandoned nearly a century before the Spanish arrived. Another theory is that it was a royal estate for Pachacuti, a sort of luxurious mountain retreat. The Inca elite certainly built estates elsewhere, and Machu Picchu's fine stonework and ceremonial architecture suggest it was designed for high-status use. The terraces could have supported enough food for a small but permanent population, and its isolation would have provided both security and privacy. Then there's the sacred theory. Many of Machu Picchu's structures align with astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, and the movement of certain stars. The Temple of the Sun, for example, has a window that frames the rising sun on the June solstice. The carved granite Intihuatana stone may have served as a ritual device to tie the sun to its place in the sky, ensuring its return after the shortest days of the year. From this perspective, Machu Picchu could have been a pilgrimage center, drawing visitors for ceremonies that linked the earthly realm to the heavens. But the sacred and the political weren't separate in Inca culture. An estate for Pachacuti could also serve as a ceremonial hub, reinforcing his divine authority. And its location between the high Andes and the Amazon basin might have had symbolic as well as strategic importance, a kind of meeting point between different worlds. The mystery deepens when you consider how it stayed hidden. The Spanish chroniclers who documented Inca cities with obsessive detail never mention Machu Picchu. This suggests the site was either unknown to them or deliberately kept secret by the Inca who survived the conquest. Its remote location and steep access routes made it easy to overlook, especially in an age without aerial mapping. When Bingham arrived in 1911, led there by local farmers who knew the ruins well, the site was overgrown, but remarkably intact. The fine masonry had resisted centuries of earthquakes and erosion. Terraces still clung to the slopes, their stone-retaining walls holding back the mountain itself. And unlike many other Inca sites, Machu Picchu hadn't been stripped bare of its stones to build later settlements. Modern research has shed light on daily life there. Excavations have uncovered tools, pottery, and human remains that suggest a population of around 300 to 500 people, mostly artisans, farmers, and retainers serving a noble or royal household. The variety of plant remains shows that goods were brought in from lower altitudes, indicating strong trade links. The skeletons reveal a mix of origins. Some individuals likely came from hundreds of miles away, hinting that Machu Picchu's inhabitants were drawn from across the empire. And yet, for all this evidence, the final chapter is missing. Why was it abandoned? The leading guess is that it was deserted around the time of the Spanish conquest, not because it was attacked, but because the Inca state itself collapsed. Without imperial support, maintaining such an isolated settlement would have been difficult. Over time, the jungle reclaimed it until only the locals remembered it was there. Of course, there are the more speculative ideas, some fringe, some poetic. A few have suggested Machu Picchu was a kind of Inca university for elite young people teaching astronomy, agriculture, and governance in a setting designed to inspire awe. Others see it as an ancient observatory built primarily for tracking celestial cycles and conducting rituals to honor them. There's even the occasional whisper about pre-Inca origins, though the archaeological evidence strongly supports a 15th century construction. Standing there today, with clouds drifting over the ridge and the stone walls glowing gold in the afternoon light, you can feel how deliberately it was placed. The mountains around it, Huayna, Picchu Putukusi, loom like guardians. The Urubamba loops below like a silver ribbon. Every view seems intentional, as if the builders were framing the landscape itself as part of the architecture. Imagine climbing the steep Inca Trail centuries ago, emerging at last through a stone gateway to see the city spread out before you. Terraced fields step down the slopes. Water flows through stone channels from a sacred spring. Priests in fine textiles conduct rituals at the Intihuatana. The emperor himself, flanked by attendants, watches as the sun aligns perfectly with the temple window. In that moment, the city is not just a place to live, it is the center of the world. We may never know exactly why Machu Picchu was built or why it was abandoned, but perhaps that's part of its power. It's a city that resists being reduced to a single definition. Its royal estate and sacred site observatory and fortress all at once, or maybe none of these, at least not in the way we imagine. The mystery is as much in what's missing as in what remains. No written records from the Inca themselves survive to tell the story. No stone tablet explains its purpose. All we have are the walls, the terraces, the alignments with the sun, and the bones of people who lived their lives here in a place balanced between heaven and earth. And maybe that's enough, because when you stand in Machu Picchu, the question you end up asking isn't just, what was this place for? It's, how did they make something so enduring, so beautiful, in a place the world forgot, and why does it still feel alive? The Baltic Sea has a strange way of hiding things in plain sight. Its cold, brackish waters slow the decay of wood-preserved metal and keep secrets for centuries. In 2011, one of those secrets came to light, or rather to sonar, when a team of Swedish treasure hunters scanning the seafloor stumbled upon something no one could quite explain. A massive circular formation 300 feet down, shaped like nothing nature should make. It quickly became known as the Baltic Sea anomaly, and from the very first blurry sonar images, the theories began to multiply like algae in summer. Some saw the outline of a crashed UFO, complete with what looked like a ramp leading off to one side. Others thought it resembled the ruins of a prehistoric stone structure, maybe built when the Baltic Basin was still dry land at the end of the last ice age. A few compared it to the Millennium Falcon from Star Wars, which probably didn't help the conspiracy theorists calm down. The discovery was made by OceanX, a private exploration company that had been searching for shipwrecks. Using side-scan sonar, they picked up the 200-foot wide object sitting about 300 feet beneath the surface, resting on a kind of pillar or ridge. What immediately stood out was its apparent symmetry and its sharp edges features that made it look, at least in the low-resolution scans, like something built rather than eroded. When the team returned to investigate with divers and a remotely operated vehicle, the mystery deepened. The object seem to have smooth, rounded surfaces in some areas and angular stair-like features in others. Divers reported what looked like scorch marks on nearby rocks, as if something had slid across them at high speed. They also described a black powder coating parts of the formation, though samples taken later turned out to be common minerals. Geologists who examined the data have offered a more grounded explanation. The anomaly is likely a glacial deposit, a remnant of rocks and sediment left behind by retreating ice sheets thousands of years ago. The Baltic seafloor is littered with such formations, though this one's shape is unusually striking. Thermal imaging also revealed that the anomaly was slightly cooler than its surroundings, which could be due to differences in material or density. But the UFO theory refuses to die. The anomaly's position at the end of what appears to be a long straight track on the seabed has fueled speculation that it crash-landed there. Some claim that electronic equipment malfunctioned when brought close to the site, though skeptics note that deep water silt and low visibility can cause all kinds of interference in underwater electronics. Another theory, less extraterrestrial but still dramatic, is that the object could be the remains of a massive ancient structure built when sea levels were lower. The Baltic region has been inhabited for at least 11,000 years, and evidence of submerged settlements has been found elsewhere in Europe. If the anomaly were man-made, it could be a relic of a civilization now lost to rising seas. The problem is we just don't have enough data. The Baltic Sea's conditions make exploration difficult. Visibility is often only a few feet, and the sediment easily clouds the water. The Ocean X team has released limited footage and images, leading critics to accuse them of hyping the mystery for publicity. Meanwhile, without high-resolution mapping and extensive sampling, it's impossible to say for certain what the formation really is. Even the natural explanation has its allure. If the anomaly is a glacial deposit, it's still a remarkable example of nature's ability to sculpt forms that play tricks on the human eye. The brain is wired to find patterns and shapes, especially circular ones, and once you start seeing artificial features, it's hard to unsee them. But it's also worth noting that the Baltic has been a crossroads for millennia. Ships from the Viking Age to World War II have gone down in its waters. Ancient trade routes crisscrossed its shores. If there were an unusual structure or artifact down there, it wouldn't be the strangest thing ever pulled from these depths. Imagine being one of the first divers to descend to the site. The water grows colder as you go down the light, fading to blue-gray. Your dive light sweeps across the seabed, featureless mud, until suddenly it hits a curved wall of stone. You swim closer, running your gloved hand over its surface. It's smooth in places, rough in others, with grooves that feel too deliberate to be random. Then out of the gloom, the rest of it emerges a massive disk, its edges fading into the darkness. You know it's probably just rock. But for a moment, it's easy to believe you've just stumbled on something not meant for human eyes. The Baltic Sea. Anomaly remains one of those mysteries caught between science and speculation. The evidence we have, points toward a natural origin, but the lack of conclusive study leaves room for wilder interpretations. It's the same tension that fuels so many great enigmas. Enough facts to ground the story, enough gaps to let the imagination run wild. And maybe that's why it continues to fascinate. Whether it's a glacial boulder sculpted by ice, an ancient ruin swallowed by the sea, or just maybe something that fell from the stars, it's a reminder that the Earth still has places that keep their secrets well. The Baltic's cold waters will preserve this one for as long as they please, and will keep wondering what really waits down there in the dark. The Franklin expedition should have been routine, at least by the standards of the 19th century British Navy. By 1845, the search for the Northwest Passage had become a matter of imperial pride. Charting a sea route through the icy channels of the Canadian Arctic would mean faster trade between Europe and Asia, and perhaps more importantly, another notch in Britain's belt of exploration. Sir John Franklin, a 59-year-old naval veteran with Arctic experience, was chosen to lead the mission. He set out with two state-of-the-art ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, and a crew of 129 men. They were never seen alive again. When the ship sailed from Greenhithe, England on May 19, 1845, optimism was high. The vessels were reinforced for ice, equipped with steam engines for auxiliary power, and stocked with 3 years' worth of food. The expedition's orders were simple in theory, but deadly in practice: navigate from the Atlantic to the Pacific through the Arctic archipelago, mapping and claiming territory along the way. Franklin had done this sort of thing before. So had many of his officers. It was dangerous work, but not unprecedented. The first winter passed without incident, or at least none that we know of. The last confirmed sighting by Europeans came in July 1845, when whaling ships encountered the Erebus and Terror, moored in Baffin Bay, waiting for ice conditions to improve. After that silence, years passed with no word. In 1848, Britain finally sent search expeditions joined by American and Canadian teams. They scoured the Arctic, finding bits and pieces, a cairn with a note left by the crew, abandoned supply caches, and later the scattered remains of men who had clearly died in desperate circumstances. That note, dated April 1848, revealed a grim timeline. Franklin had died in June 1847. By then, both ships had been trapped in ice near King William Island for over a year and a half. Supplies were dwindling. The surviving 105 men had abandoned the ships, attempting to march south toward the Back River. None made it. Inuit oral histories filled in chilling details. Groups of starving, frostbitten sailors were seen dragging sledges over the ice. Some appeared to have resorted to cannibalism, a claim long dismissed by the British Admiralty, but later supported by forensic evidence. In the 1980s, autopsies of crewmen buried on Beechy Island showed high levels of lead in their bones, likely from the solder used to seal their tinned food. Lead poisoning could have caused weakness, confusion, and poor decision-making at the worst possible time. But lead wasn't the only problem. The food itself may have been tainted. Some barrels were poorly sealed, allowing spoilage and botulism to set in. Combined with scurvy, extreme cold, and the physical toll of months in the ice, the crew's condition would have deteriorated rapidly. And then there's the question of the ships. For more than 160 years, no one knew exactly where they had gone down. The ice could have crushed them, or they might have drifted after being abandoned. It wasn't until 2014 that the wreck of the Erebus was found in shallow water near King William Island, almost perfectly preserved in the cold, low-oxygen environment. 2 years later, the Terror was discovered in Terror Bay, astonishingly intact. Even its glass windows were still in place. The wrecks have added new layers to the mystery. The Terror appears to have been sealed up for winter, with everything stowed neatly, as if the crew had intended to return. Why then did they abandon it? Some archaeologists suggest the ships may have drifted free of the ice after being deserted, carried south by currents before sinking. Others wonder if small parties of survivors tried to return too late to save themselves. Inuit accounts also tell of one ship sinking suddenly while the other drifted south with its masts still visible for months. These oral histories, once dismissed by Victorian explorers, have proven remarkably accurate in guiding modern searchers to the wrecks. Even with the ships found, there's still no single cause to point to, no villain to blame beyond the sheer brutality of the Arctic. It was a convergence of failures, poisoned food lead contamination ice that refused to thaw, and perhaps an overconfidence in British naval technology that underestimated the land, the sea, and the people who knew it best. Picture that final march in April 1848. Over 100 men, weakened and frostbitten, hauling heavy sledges across a landscape of jagged ice and snow. The horizon is endless white, the wind slicing through every layer of clothing. Each step is a battle against exhaustion. The sun is climbing higher now, spring by Arctic standards, but it brings no warmth. Behind them, the Erebus and Terror sit locked in the ice-black shapes against the glare. They will never sail again. The Franklin expedition became both a tragedy and an obsession. Search parties kept going back for decades, some vanishing themselves. It spurred the mapping of vast areas of the Canadian Arctic at a staggering human cost, and it left behind one of the most enduring maritime mysteries in history. Not just how they died, but what those final days felt like. Standing today on the gravel beaches of King William Island, you can see where the ice meets the sea, and you can almost imagine the dark outlines of two ships beneath the water. The wrecks rest there still, their timbers creaking in the current, their decks holding secrets sealed away for more than 170 years. Divers are carefully exploring them, now documenting everything from the galley stoves to the officers' cabins. Somewhere down there, in a locked chest or a captain's desk, there may still be a log book or a personal diary, words frozen in time that could finally tell the full story. Until then, the Franklin expedition remains a reminder that nature does not care for human ambition. The ice closes and the ships sink, and the Arctic keeps its silence. Off the coast of Japan's Ryukyu Islands, the Pacific floor rises sharply before plunging again into the blue-black deep. It's here, near the island of Yonaguni, that divers in 1986 stumbled upon something so massive, so eerily geometric, that it sparked a debate still raging nearly 4 decades later. Is this the Yonaguni Monument the work of nature, or of a civilization long forgotten? The discovery was accidental. A local diver, Kihachiro Aratake, was exploring the seabed in search of good spots to observe hammerhead sharks. At a depth of around 80 feet, his flashlight beam caught sharp angles in the rock flat terraces, right-angled corners, and steps so precise they looked carved. What lay before him wasn't a scattered pile of boulders. It was a sprawling structure, nearly 500 feet long, and rising more than 80 feet from the seabed, with multiple levels connected by broad ramps and narrow passageways. The central formation resembles a stepped pyramid or ziggurat, its staircases leading to flat platforms that could almost be ceremonial plazas. Other features include what some have called a road, leading away from the monument, a huge triangular formation with perfect symmetry and an arrangement of upright stones that looks like a row of pillars. In certain light, the shadows cast by these blocks make it almost impossible to believe they were formed by chance. For proponents of the artificial theory, the Yonaguni Monument is evidence of an advanced culture existing in Japan's prehistoric past, perhaps dating back to 10,000 years ago, when sea levels were much lower and this site would have been above water. Some even suggest it could be connected to the mythical lost continent of Mu, a kind of Pacific counterpart to Atlantis. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura, one of the site's most prominent researchers, has argued for years that the monument is at least partially man-made. He points to what he describes as tool marks, possible carvings of animals and symbols, and the presence of nearby stone circles on land that could have been part of the same culture. He estimates the monument could be 5,000 to 8,000 years old, which would make it older than the pyramids of Egypt. Skeptics, however, see it differently. They argue that the sandstone and mudstone layers in the area naturally fracture along horizontal and vertical planes, creating geometric shapes when subjected to tectonic activity and wave erosion. In this view, the steps are just natural ledges, the plazas are flat bedding planes, and the sharp angles are coincidental results of the rock's internal structure. Yet even skeptics admit the site's scale is extraordinary. The main monument alone could rival large ancient structures in size, and the uniformity of its angles is difficult to ignore. For divers swimming along its edges, the effect is disorienting. You're underwater. Yet the terrain feels like a city without people, its streets empty and silent. The debate becomes even more intriguing when you consider the broader region's history. The Ryukyu Islands sit in an area that would have been dry land during the last ice age, when sea levels were up to 400 feet lower. Archaeological evidence from other parts of Japan shows that people lived here during that period, building stone structures and leaving behind pottery. Could a community have constructed something monumental only to have it swallowed by the rising seas around 8,000 years ago? There's also the matter of the so-called face. Divers have photographed what appears to be a large human-like profile carved into the rock, complete with a defined brown nose and lips. Some think it's an intentional sculpture. Others believe it's another example of pareidolia, our tendency to see faces in random shapes. Still, it adds to the site's aura of mystery. From a diver's perspective, the Yonaguni Monument is haunting. You descend through clear blue water, the sunlight filtering down in beams. At first, it's just sand and scattered rocks. Then the shadow looms massive layered geometric. Swimming closer, you run your hand along a wall that feels too straight, too smooth. The steps rise in perfect intervals, each one wide enough to walk on if you weren't floating. Turn a corner, and the light drops away into a narrow passage that seems to lead somewhere important, though there's nothing but water and silence at the end. For now, the site remains unprotected and largely unexplored by official archaeological bodies. Most research has been conducted by independent divers and a handful of academics with limited funding and no consensus. Japan's government has not committed to large-scale excavation or preservation efforts, partly because the site's artificial origin has never been proven. That's the sticking point proof. If tools, artifacts, or other unambiguous signs of human activity were found in direct association with the monument, the debate would shift overnight. But the ocean is an unforgiving archivist. Current sediment and marine life can erase or bury evidence over millennia. If anything was once here, statues, pottery, even wooden beams, it's possible they've been lost to time. Still, the site draws divers and dreamers from around the world, each hoping to glimpse something that will tilt the argument one way or the other. And maybe that's part of the monument's power. Whether it's a quirk of geology or the last remnant of a drowned civilization, it forces us to think about the vast stretches of human history and prehistory we don't know. Standing on the shore of Yonaguni, watching the waves roll in, it's strange to think that beneath them might lie the answer to a story we've never heard. It might be the story of people who built in stone before the pyramids, whose names we'll never know, whose city sank without a trace except for these steps into the deep. Or it might be the story of rock and water working together, patiently sculpting something so beautiful and strange that we can't help but see ourselves in it. Either way, the Yonaguni Monument reminds us that not all mysteries are buried in archives or locked in tombs. Some are just sitting there in the open, waiting for someone to dive down and look and then argue about what they've found for the next 100 years. The city of Alexandria has always been a crossroads of continents, cultures, and empires. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BC, it became the beating heart of the Ptolemaic kingdom, home to towering lighthouses, sprawling palaces, and the fabled Great Library. For centuries, it was the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world. But beneath the bustle of the modern Egyptian port city, another Alexandria sleeps, the one that collapsed into the sea. Most visitors today stroll the Corniche without realizing that hundreds of acres of the ancient city once extended beyond the current shoreline. Over 2,000 years ago, Parts of the royal quarter, including temples, causeways, and even the palace of Cleopatra VII, stood on islands and peninsulas now lying 20 to 30 feet underwater. Earthquakes, tsunamis, and gradual subsidence have taken their toll, and the sea has claimed what was once the political and ceremonial center of Egypt's last pharaohs. The story of its rediscovery began in earnest in the 1990s when French underwater archaeologist Frank Godiot began systematic surveys of Alexandria's harbor. Using sonar mapping and diving expeditions, his team uncovered a labyrinth of ruins, colossal statues toppled onto the seabed sphinxes, half buried in sand-massive stone blocks, carved with hieroglyphs and even fragments of ceremonial barges. The finds confirmed what ancient texts had hinted at, that the royal quarter had been a dazzling showcase of Ptolemaic power and Greek-Egyptian fusion. Among the most tantalizing discoveries were structures believed to be part of Cleopatra's palace complex, including a semicircular harbor wall and foundations for grand halls. Nearby lay artifacts that seemed to whisper of her reign coins, bearing her likeness jewelry, and items linked to her legendary lover, Mark Antony. These were not just remnants of a city, they were pieces of a story that ended in one of history's most famous double suicides. But the ruins also hint at an even older past. Beneath the Ptolemaic layers, Godiot's team found evidence of earlier settlements, possibly dating back to the pharaohs of the New Kingdom. Some of the granite blocks bear the cartouches of rulers from over 1,000 years before Alexander's time. This suggests that Alexandria's location at the meeting point of the Nile and the Mediterranean had been a place of significance long before it became a cosmopolitan capital. What caused the city to slip into the water? The answer seems to be a combination of geology and disaster. The Nile Delta is built on soft sediments which can compact and sink over time, a process known as subsidence. Add to that the region's seismic activity, and you have a recipe for catastrophe. Historical records mention major earthquakes striking the area in the 4th and 8th centuries AD, accompanied by tsunamis that inundated the coast. These events could have toppled buildings into the sea and opened fissures that swallowed whole sections of the shoreline. Standing on a modern dive boat in Alexandria's harbor, it's hard to imagine the grandeur that once stood here. But descend into the murky green water, and shapes start to emerge the corner of a temple wall. A row of column drums lying like fallen chess pieces, the head of a statue staring upward through clouds of silt. Divers must navigate carefully. Visibility can be low, and the artifacts are fragile after centuries underwater. Yet there's a sense of awe in knowing you're swimming through streets once walked by Cleopatra herself. The finds haven't just enriched our picture of ancient Alexandria, they've reshaped it. For centuries, scholars debated whether Cleopatra's palace had been inland or on an island. Now we know it likely straddled both, with causeways and harbors connecting it to the city's ceremonial core. The underwater ruins also reveal the extent of the city's trade networks, with imported marble from Greece basalt, from the Nile's quarries, and luxury goods from across the Mediterranean. Still, much remains hidden. Gaudio estimates that only a fraction of the submerged city has been mapped, let alone excavated. Political instability and environmental challenges make progress slow. And there's the ever-present threat of modern development, dredging port expansion, and pollution all risk disturbing or destroying what's left. There's also the matter of Canopus and Heracleion, two ancient cities lying just east of Alexandria, also discovered underwater. These were thriving ports in the late period and Ptolemaic times, bustling with merchants, pilgrims, and festivals in honor of Osiris. Like parts of Alexandria, they vanished beneath the waves due to earthquakes, floods, and subsidence. Today, they form part of a vast interconnected archaeological landscape under the Bay of Abukir, a reminder that the sea here is not just a boundary, it's a vault. The romance of it all is hard to resist. Imagine a clear day in Cleopatra's Alexandria, the lighthouse of Pharos, towering above the harbor, its fires burning even at midday. Gilded barges gliding between the palace islands, philosophers debating in shaded courtyards, markets spilling over with spices, papyrus, and silk. Then imagine the ground trembling, the sea rising, and centuries of history disappearing beneath the waves in minutes. Every artifact pulled from the bay feels like a message from that vanished world. A gold earring still shines after 2 millennia. A granite block still bears the chisel's marks. Together, they make Alexandria's underwater ruins one of archaeology's richest and most fragile time capsules. Perhaps one day, advances in underwater excavation will allow more of the royal quarter to be revealed, and we'll be able to walk again among the halls where Cleopatra planned her alliances and defied her enemies. Until then, the city sleeps in the green depths, its columns and courtyards slowly settling into the sand, waiting for the next diver to sweep away the silt and see history staring back. In the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, time stopped in an instant. The year was 79 AD, and the Roman towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum were thriving. The streets bustled with merchants, bakers, artisans, and politicians. Frescoed villas opened onto fragrant gardens. Bathhouses steamed with scented water. Life here was orderly and familiar, until without warning, the mountain that had loomed in the distance for generations erupted. We know the broad strokes. The eruption spewed ash pumice and lethal clouds of gas into the sky. Within hours, Pompeii was buried under meters of volcanic debris, its citizens trapped where they stood, sat, or slept. Herculaneum, closer to the volcano, was hit by searing pyroclastic surges waves of superheated gas and ash that carbonized wood and instantly killed anyone in their path. The towns were lost for nearly 1700 years, preserved in eerie detail under layers of hardened ash. But what's less certain even now is exactly how the people died and why some bodies appear in such strange positions. When the ruins were first excavated in the 18th and 19th centuries, archaeologists uncovered hollow spaces in the ash voids where bodies had decomposed, leaving only impressions in the hardened material. By filling these voids with plaster, they created casts of the victims frozen in their final moments. Some lie curled in fetal positions. Others seem to be shielding their faces. A few are sprawled as if running. For years, the prevailing belief was that most victims suffocated from volcanic gases or ash. But more recent studies suggest many died far more suddenly from thermal shock. In Herculaneum, for example, analysis of skeletons found along the ancient shoreline shows that their bones cracked and skulls exploded from the extreme heat, which may have reached over 500 degrees C, 932 degrees in seconds. That's hot enough to vaporize flesh before someone could take a single breath. And yet, the scenes in Pompeii tell a different story. The layers of pumice that fell there suggest a slower burial hours of ash fall, during which many residents might have fled. So why didn't they? Some may have stayed to guard property, or believed the worst had passed after the initial eruption. Others may have been trapped by collapsing roofs or debris. There's also evidence that many attempted to take shelter indoors, a fatal decision when buildings began to give way under the weight of volcanic material. The remains also preserve mysteries about the people themselves. DNA analysis has revealed surprising diversity among the victims, including individuals from other parts of the Roman Empire, suggesting Pompeii was more cosmopolitan than often assumed. Artifacts found with the bodies tell personal stories. A woman clutching a pouch of gold jewelry. A man with a sword and belt buckle from the eastern provinces. A child holding a pet dog. Even the volcano's timeline is under debate. For centuries, historians dated the eruption to August 24th, based on a letter from Pliny the Younger, who witnessed it from across the Bay of Naples. But evidence from clothing food remains, and inscription suggests it may have occurred in late autumn, perhaps in October or November. One recently discovered charcoal inscription on a house wall even dates to mid-October, just days before the disaster, making an August date unlikely. And then there are the buildings themselves. The eruption preserved Pompeii mid-renovation scaffolding still stands in some areas, evidence of repairs from an earthquake 17 years earlier. Graffiti on walls offers glimpses of daily life, from political slogans to crude jokes to declarations of love. Shops still held amphorae of wine. Bakeries still had loaves of bread in their ovens, carbonized but intact. It's this strange combination, a bustling city frozen mid-action, that makes Pompeii so haunting. Herculaneum's preservation is in some ways even more extraordinary. The pyroclastic surges sealed the city in an airless cocoon, carbonizing wood furniture and even food. Entire second stories of houses remain with painted wooden balconies still in place. Scrolls from the Villa of the Papyri, a vast private library, were reduced to brittle charcoal, but are now being slowly unrolled using advanced imaging technology, revealing ancient Greek philosophical texts that might otherwise have been lost forever. What's striking is how much we still don't know. There are unexcavated sections of both Pompeii and Herculaneum deliberately left untouched to preserve them for future archaeologists with better tools. There may be hidden chambers filled with art documents and artifacts that could change our understanding of Roman life. There's also a lingering question. Did some people escape? We know survivors fled to nearby towns and villages, and Roman records mention efforts to recover property afterward. But for many families, the names of the missing were probably never recorded. their stories lost with the city. Standing in Pompeii today, the paradox is overwhelming. The streets are alive with tourists, yet lined with silent, roofless houses. You can walk into a villa and see frescoes as vivid as the day they were painted, or step into a bathhouse with its marble benches still smooth from use. And then in a quiet corner, you might find one of the plaster casts a reminder that this was not just an archaeological wonder, but a tragedy that unfolded in real time for thousands of people. If you try, you can picture that morning in 79 AD. The air begins to darken, a fine ash falling like snow. The ground trembles underfoot. In the distance, the mountain roars, and a towering column of smoke rises into the sky. People run, shout, gather their belongings. Some head for the gates. Others stay behind. Hours later, the streets are buried. Days later, the world moves on. Centuries later, the ash is still there, holding them in place, waiting for someone to dig down and ask what happened. The answers are still coming piece by piece. Every new excavation, every forensic study, every inscription read for the first time peels back another layer. And yet the biggest mystery, the one that keeps Pompeii and Herculaneum alive in our imaginations, is not just how they died, but how their lives were lived in those final hours before the sky fell. Somewhere in the Ionian Sea, between the islands of Kefalonia and Zakynthos, the water hides a secret that may or may not be tied to one of the oldest mysteries in European literature, the true location of Ithaca, home of Odysseus. For more than 2 millennia, scholars, poets, and armchair adventurers have argued about where Homer's hero actually lived, and whether the Ithaca described in the Odyssey matches any real island we can point to today. On the surface, it should be simple. There is a modern Greek island called Ithaki, or Ithaca, a rugged, beautiful place in the Ionian Sea, and it proudly claims to be the hero's home. Tourists come for its beaches, its olive groves, and its marketing as the island of Odysseus. But a careful reading of the Odyssey raises problems. Homer's Ithaca, according to the text, was low-lying compared to its neighbors, and it lay furthest to the west. Modern Ithaki, by contrast, is mountainous and sits east of nearby islands like Kefalonia. For centuries, this mismatch was brushed aside, poetic license perhaps, or changes in geography over time. But in the last few decades, some researchers have suggested something far more radical, that the Ithaca of Homer's day might not be the same as the island called Ithaca today. One of the most intriguing theories comes from British businessman-turned-archaeologist Robert Bittlestone. In his 2005 book, Odysseus Unbound, Bittlestone argued that the real Ithaca was actually part of the Peliki Peninsula on the western side of Kefalonia. Today, Peliki is connected to the rest of Kefalonia by a narrow strip of land, but Bittlestone's team proposed that in ancient times, this strip was under the sea, making Peliki its own island, lying further west than modern Ithaki, and matching Homer's description perfectly. According to this theory, earthquakes and landslides common in the seismically active Ionian region gradually filled in the channel between Peliki and Kefalonia sometime after the Bronze Age. This would mean that the geography Homer described wasn't wrong. It's just that the coastline has shifted dramatically over the last 3,000 years. Supporters point to geological surveys showing deep layers of rockfall and sediment in the area, suggesting the isthmus is relatively recent in geological terms. If that land bridge didn't exist during the late Bronze Age, Palikhi would indeed have been a separate island and possibly the Ithaca, where Odysseus returned after his decade-long journey. Skeptics counter that the evidence is circumstantial. There's no definitive archaeological site on Palikhi that can be linked to a Mycenaean palace or settlement of the scale we might expect for a king like Odysseus. Others note that Homer may have drawn from multiple oral traditions, blending geography and legend in ways that were never meant to match a single real-world map. And then there's the question of whether the Odyssey is even meant to be geographically literal. The poem mixes real Mediterranean locations with fantastical places like the land of the Cyclopes or the island of Circe. Odysseus's journey may have been less a travelogue and more a symbolic tale of homecoming resilience and the trials of leadership. If that's the case, Ithaca might be more of an idea than a fixed spot on the map. Still, the search goes on. Archaeologists have excavated sites on modern Ithaki Kefalonia and nearby islands looking for traces of Mycenaean-era structures, storerooms, pottery, and fortifications that might hint at a royal seat. In 2010, a large complex was uncovered on modern Ithaki, complete with staircases, courtyards, and artifacts dating to the 13th century BC. Some hailed it as the long-lost palace of Odysseus. Others cautioned that without inscriptions or definitive links, it's impossible to make that leap. There's also the curious matter of the Cave of the Nymphs on modern Ithaki, a real cave that local tradition has associated with the one mentioned in the Odyssey. Inside, there are ancient carvings and niches that could have been used for offerings. It's tempting to imagine sailors stopping here to pay respects before or after a voyage, perhaps reinforcing the island's association with Odysseus, even if it wasn't the original Ithaca. What's undeniable is that the Ionian Islands were part of the Mycenaean world, and their harbors, hills, and valleys would have been familiar to traders, fishermen, and warriors of Homer's time. Whether Odysseus himself was a historical figure, a composite of several leaders, or entirely fictional, his home would have been rooted in the geography and politics of this region. Standing on a headland on modern Ithaki, you can see why the myth endures. The sea stretches out in every direction, dotted with green islands and shimmering in the sun. It's easy to picture a ship appearing on the horizon oars, flashing the crew weary but determined. Somewhere in the hills above, a loyal dog waits by the gate, and a queen holds off her suitors a little longer. Maybe that's the real reason the search for Ithaca matters. It's not just about solving a geographical puzzle. It's about anchoring a story that has meant something to humanity for nearly 3,000 years. Finding the real Ithaca would be like touching the edge of the ancient world and feeling it push back. Proof that the place we've imagined all this time was more than just a poet's invention. Or maybe it doesn't matter if we ever prove it. Homer's Ithaca, wherever it was, has already done its work. It has given us a destination both literal and symbolic to journey toward. Whether it's Palikhi, modern Ithaki, or an island lost to time. The idea of Ithaca endures the place you fight to get back to, no matter how long the voyage. And in that sense, perhaps every sailor, every traveler, every person who has ever longed for home already knows exactly where it is. On a windswept hill in southern England, the stones rise in a circle like frozen sentinels, their weathered surfaces etched by thousands of years of wind and rain. Stonehenge is one of the most famous prehistoric monuments in the world, and yet for all the postcards, drone shots, and tourist buses, we still can't say with certainty why it was built, how it was used, or even exactly how it was constructed. What we do know is that Stonehenge wasn't built all at once. Its construction unfolded in multiple stages over roughly 1,500 years, beginning around 3000 BC. The earliest phase wasn't even stone at all, a circular ditch and bank dug with antler picks, marking a sacred enclosure. The first stones, massive sarsens and smaller bluestones from Wales, were added centuries later. The arrangement we see today, with the iconic trilithons, two upright stones capped by a horizontal lintel, dates to around 2500 BC. That alone is staggering when you think about it. Some of these stones weigh up to 25 tons, and the bluestones had to be transported more than 150 miles from the Preseli Hills in Wales. How Neolithic builders managed this without wheels, draft animals, or metal tools remains one of Stonehenge's enduring logistical puzzles. Theories range from wooden sledges and rollers to rafts along rivers combined with sheer human muscle. Experimental archaeologists have shown it's possible, but only with enormous labor and coordination. And that's before we even get to the why. For decades, Stonehenge was interpreted mainly as a religious or ceremonial site, possibly a temple to ancient deities. Its alignment with the solstices, most famously the sunrise on the summer solstice and the sunset on the winter solstice, suggests it was also an astronomical observatory, tracking the movements of the sun and perhaps the moon. The precise alignments could have helped mark seasonal changes crucial for agriculture ritual or both. Recent research has added layers to the story. Excavations in the surrounding landscape have revealed that Stonehenge was part of a much larger complex, including avenues, timber circles, burial mounds, and nearby settlements like Durrington Walls. Isotope analysis of animal bones found at these sites suggests that people traveled from all over Britain to gather here, bringing pigs and cattle for massive feasts. Some animals came from as far away as Scotland, meaning Stonehenge may have been a center for national-scale gatherings, not just a local shrine. Then there's the possibility that it was a monument to the dead. The earliest burials at the site date to around 3000 BC, and later phases seem to incorporate cremated remains within the circle. Some researchers think the stones themselves, enduring immovable, symbolize the eternal world of the ancestors, in contrast to wooden structures that represented the transient world of the living. One of the most intriguing theories connects Stonehenge to sound. Acoustic experiments have shown that the arrangement of the stones can amplify and focus certain frequencies, creating an otherworldly resonance. This has led to speculation that rituals here may have involved music, chanting, or drumming that used the monument's shape to enhance the experience. And then there are the fringe theories, the ones that fill coffee table books and late-night documentaries: aliens, lost civilizations, Atlantean architects. While mainstream archaeology finds no evidence for any of these, they persist because Stonehenge is one of those places that feels like it must have a bigger story, one that stretches beyond what we can see or prove. Even the people who built it remain partly mysterious. We know from genetic and isotopic evidence that the Neolithic population of Britain was largely descended from early European farmers who migrated from the continent. By the time Stonehenge was completed, these communities were interacting with incoming groups from the Eurasian steppe. The monument may have been a way to unify different peoples, cultures, and traditions, a massive project that gave them a shared purpose and identity. Visiting today, it's easy to forget how much of Stonehenge's drama comes from its setting. The surrounding plain is wide and open, the sky vast and changeable. Clouds sweep over in minutes, bathing the stones in sunlight and shadow. Standing within the circle, something only possible on special tours, you can see how the stones frame the horizon. The trilithons tower over you, their lintels still locked in place by mortise and tenon joints, a feat of prehistoric carpentry scaled up to monumental proportions. Imagine the scene 4,000 years ago. The air is crisp. A crowd gathers, their clothing of woven wool and leather, their faces painted or tattooed for ceremony. Drums beat in slow rhythm. The sun begins to rise, and a shaft of light slices cleanly between two stones, illuminating the altar at the center. Voices rise and chant, the sound echoing strangely around the circle. For those gathered, this is not just a sunrise, it's the turning of the year, the renewal of cosmic order, the assurance that the world is still aligned as it should be. Of course, the mystery isn't just in the stones, it's in the gaps. Why were some stones taken down or never completed? Why does the arrangement shift slightly between phases of construction? And what exactly happened here in the centuries after the main monument was finished? We know Stonehenge remained in use for over 1,000 years. But by the time the Romans arrived, it was already an ancient relic, its builders long forgotten. The landscape itself may hold more answers. In recent years, ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed dozens of buried features, pits, ditches, and post holes stretching for miles around the site. Some may predate Stonehenge. Others may have been part of later activity. Together, they suggest that what we think of as Stonehenge was actually the focal point of a vast ceremonial landscape used and reused by successive generations for purposes we can only guess at. In the end, maybe that's why Stonehenge continues to fascinate. It's not just an archaeological site, it's a riddle in plain sight. We can measure it, date it, and even reconstruct parts of it, but we can't quite fit all the pieces into a single satisfying answer. And perhaps we're not meant to. As you step away from the circle and glance back one last time, the stones seem different, less like static ruins, more like actors frozen mid-performance. The wind moves through them like breath. The sun slips behind a cloud, shadowing the lintels, and for a moment, You can almost imagine the voices, the drums, the sense of something vast and ancient unfolding in this open sacred space. Off the southern coast of Japan, in the waters of Okinawa Prefecture, there lies a submerged landscape that has kept archaeologists, divers, and storytellers debating for decades. Scattered across several sites from Yonaguni to the Karama Islands are a series of underwater stone formations that some believe may be the remains of a lost civilization, structures so geometric and deliberate looking that they seem to blur the line between geology and architecture. While Yonaguni gets most of the fame, the Okinawa underwater ruins as a whole are a broader, more mysterious puzzle. The story begins in the late 20th century when divers exploring the region started reporting strange features beneath the waves. Flat platforms, rectangular blocks stacked like steps long, straight roads that vanish into the deep and isolated stone monoliths, standing upright as if marking a sacred site. Photographs and video footage soon followed, sparking both excitement and skepticism. Some of these features are massive. One step structure near Aguni Island rises more than 20 feet from the seabed and has terraces that look almost identical in size and shape to man-made platforms on land. Another site shows two large upright stones with a flat slab bridging them like a lintel, forming what appears to be a gateway. Still others show cross-shaped cuts or parallel grooves that could be tool marks if, of course, tools were involved. The allure is obvious. If these are indeed man-made, they could date back to a time when sea levels were much lower, perhaps during the last ice age over 10,000 years ago. Back then, much of the East China Sea's shallow shelf would have been dry land, potentially home to cultures we know nothing about. That would place the Okinawa ruins among the oldest known structures on Earth, predating Stonehenge and the pyramids by thousands of years. Supporters of the man-made theory often point to the uniformity of angles and the precision of certain features. The roads have straight edges that run for dozens of feet. The steps are evenly spaced and sharply defined. At Yonaguni, one particularly famous formation includes a flat wall rising vertically from the seabed, intersected by a perfect right-angled corner. There are also claims of carved symbols and animal shapes, though these are harder to verify in the low-visibility, sediment-heavy waters. Skeptics, however, argue that the region's geology can easily account for such shapes without human involvement. Much of the bedrock here is sandstone and mudstone, which naturally fractures along horizontal and vertical planes. Over time, tectonic activity and ocean currents can erode these fractures into formations that look artificial, but are entirely natural. In this view, the Okinawa ruins are simply the result of nature's own slow, patient masonry. The debate is complicated by the fact that there's no definitive archaeological evidence, no pottery shards tools, or other cultural artifacts directly associated with the underwater structures. If a prehistoric culture built them, they left behind no obvious traces beyond the stones themselves. That absence could be explained by the sheer amount of time that's passed combined with the scouring forces of the ocean. But it also leaves plenty of room for doubt. Adding to the intrigue are local legends. Okinawan folklore speaks of ancient kingdoms that were swallowed by the sea, and some stories tell of a land of the gods that once existed to the south before vanishing beneath the waves. While it's dangerous to treat myth as literal history, such tales often preserve memories of real events, such as post-Ice Age flooding, that could have inspired them. From a diver's perspective, visiting these sites is a surreal experience. The water here is a deep clear blue, and sunlight filters down in pale shifting beams. Fish dart through the shadows of massive stone blocks. You swim along a wall that rises like a fortress, your bubbles drifting upward in silver streams. Every corner you turn seems to present a shape that your brain instantly tries to categorize: a stair, a doorway, a plaza. Are you seeing the handiwork of humans long gone, or just the artistry of wind, water, and time? Marine geologist Masaki Kimura, who has studied both Yonaguni and the other Okinawa sites extensively, is convinced that at least some of the formations are man-made or man-modified. He points to possible quarry marks arrangements of standing stones and features that appear to align with celestial events. His critics argue that without more concrete evidence, such interpretations risk projecting intention onto random patterns, much like seeing castles in clouds. Part of what makes the Okinawa ruins so compelling is their scale and distribution. They're not confined to a single location, but appear at multiple points across the seafloor, suggesting either a widespread natural process or, if you prefer the more romantic option, a culture with far-reaching influence. If they are the latter, then we're looking at a society capable of working massive stone blocks and laying out complex designs at a time when mainstream history says such capabilities didn't exist here. There's also the possibility of a middle ground, that natural formations were later modified by humans. This is something we see in other ancient sites, where people adapted existing rock outcrops or geological features into ceremonial or functional spaces. If early Okinawan inhabitants encountered striking natural structures along their coasts, they may have shaped them further, adding carvings or altering steps to suit their needs. Sadly, the ocean isn't kind to patient archaeological work. Strong current storms and the ever-present risk of damage to fragile sites make extensive exploration difficult. Funding is also limited. Underwater archaeology is expensive, and without a guarantee of major finds, it's a hard sell for large-scale investment. For now, the Okinawa underwater ruins remain in that frustratingly beautiful category of mysteries. There's enough to suggest something extraordinary, but not enough to prove it beyond doubt. The stones keep their counsel, the water keeps its secrets, and we keep wondering what lies beneath the silt and coral that's slowly claiming them. Standing on the cliffs of Okinawa, looking out over the endless blue, it's tempting to imagine the coastline as it might have been 12,000 years ago. Wide plains stretching to the horizon, rivers winding through forests, and in the distance, massive stone platforms gleaming in the sun. People gather there, fishermen, traders, priests, unaware that the ice sheets far to the north are melting, that the seas are rising, that one day their home will be a place where only fish and divers wander. Maybe someday a breakthrough in technology or a lucky find will give us the missing piece, a carved inscription, a buried tool, something that bridges the gap between geology and archaeology. Until then, the Okinawa ruins will remain exactly what they are now, part science, part legend, and wholly captivating. Deep in the heart of Cambodia, shrouded by thick jungle and the creeping roots of strangler figs, lies a city that once ruled one of the most powerful empires in Southeast Asia. Angkor, capital of the Khmer Empire, wasn't just a city, it was a sprawling urban complex larger than modern-day Paris, home to hundreds of thousands of people. At its height, it boasted magnificent stone temples, sophisticated water systems, and an empire that stretched across much of present-day Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. And yet by the 15th century, the city had been largely abandoned. Today, the ruins of Angkor are best known for Angkor Wat, the breathtaking temple complex, whose lotus-shaped towers have become Cambodia's national symbol. Built in the early 12th century by King Suryavarman II, Angkor Wat was originally a Hindu temple dedicated to Vishnu, later converted into a Buddhist site. Its intricate bas-reliefs depict epic battles, celestial dancers, and scenes from Hindu mythology, all carved with an artistry that has survived nearly 1,000 monsoons. But Angkor Wat is just one jewel in a vast crown. The city was a marvel of engineering, with a network of reservoirs, canals, and moats that controlled the seasonal floods and ensured a steady water supply year-round. These hydraulic systems supported extensive rice agriculture, which in turn sustained a massive population and funded monumental construction projects. The question that has haunted archaeologists for decades is, why did this mighty city fall? Several theories compete for the answer. One points to environmental stress. Studies of sediment from the region show evidence of prolonged droughts in the 14th and 15th centuries, punctuated by intense floods. These extremes would have strained Angkor's water management systems, damaging canals and reservoirs that were critical to both agriculture and transportation. Without a stable food supply, the city's economic foundation may have crumbled. Another theory focuses on political instability. By the 14th century, the Khmer Empire faced pressure from rival states, particularly the rising power of Ayutthaya in what is now Thailand. In 1431, Ayutthayan forces sacked Angkor, and while the city wasn't completely destroyed, its political center shifted south to Phnom Penh. Some historians believe this move was strategic, closer to emerging trade routes along the Mekong River. But it also marked the beginning of Angkor's decline. Religion may have played a role as well. The shift from Hinduism to Theravada Buddhism during the empire's later years changed the nature of royal patronage. The grand, labor-intensive temple projects of earlier centuries gave way to smaller, simpler constructions. Without the constant influx of resources and manpower that monumental building provided, the city's infrastructure may have gradually deteriorated. And then there's the idea of overreach. Angkor's expansion required a constant supply of resources, stone, timber, labor that may have pushed the surrounding environment and population to their limits. The city's grandeur may have been its undoing, a victim of its own ambition. Walking through Angkor today, it's hard to reconcile the quiet tree-shaded ruins with the bustling metropolis it once was. At top Rome, massive silk cotton trees grow out of the temple walls, their roots coiling like stone serpents. At Bayonne, the temple at the heart of Angkor, Tom 200 giant stone faces smile enigmatically from towers that catch the light at sunrise and sunset. The sheer scale of the place is overwhelming. Kilometers of causeways, gates, guarded by rows of stone warriors, and temple complexes large enough to get lost in. Modern technology has revealed even more. Using Lidar scanning from aircraft, archaeologists have mapped an extensive network of roads, canals, and urban grids hidden beneath the forest floor. These scans show that Angkor was far larger and more organized than previously imagined, with suburbs, industrial zones, and agricultural fields stretching far beyond the central temples. The findings suggest a level of urban planning and infrastructure unmatched anywhere else in the medieval world. But even this advanced system couldn't withstand the combined forces of climate change, political upheaval, and shifting economic patterns. By the time European explorers stumbled upon Angkor in the 16th century, much of it was already overgrown, its temples used primarily as pilgrimage sites by local communities. And yet Angkor never truly disappeared. Its cultural and spiritual significance endured, preserved in legends, folk traditions, and the devotion of Buddhist monks who continued to care for key temples. In the 19th century, French explorers brought Angkor to the attention of the wider world, sparking a wave of restoration and study that continues to this day. The mystery of Angkor's fall isn't just an academic question, it's a story with modern resonance. The city's vulnerability to climate extremes and environmental degradation mirrors challenges faced by urban centers today. Its rise and fall remind us that even the most sophisticated civilizations depend on a delicate balance between nature, technology, and human ambition. Picture Angkor at its height. The steady hum of daily life, the clang of chisels shaping stone, the rhythmic splash of water wheels lifting irrigation channels, the smell of incense drifting from temple courtyards. Thousands of people move through the streets. Merchants in brightly dyed cloth, soldiers in bronze helmets, priests chanting prayers. The king's palace glitters with gold leaf and silks. From the top of a temple tower, you can see the vast reservoirs glinting in the sun, the lifeblood of the empire. Then imagine the slow unraveling. The canals clog with silt after an unseasonal flood. A drought follows, shrinking the reservoirs. The rice harvest fails. The court debates strategy as Ayutthayan armies mass at the borders. The king orders a retreat to the south. Temples are left untended. Stone blocks shift and crack as tree roots creep in. The jungle begins its patient work, and within a generation, nature reclaims what humans had built. Today, the air at Angkor is thick with humidity and the scent of damp earth. The jungle hums with cicadas and bird calls. Tourists in wide-brimmed hats wander the causeways, cameras clicking. But in the quieter corners, down a side path under the shadow of a crumbling tower, You can almost hear the echo of that ancient city still breathing beneath the roots and the soil. In the windswept mountains of the Andes, 13,000 feet above sea level, a forgotten city of stone clings to the edge of a plateau. Long before Machu Picchu became the poster child of Inca achievement, this other place, Sacsayhuamán, was already standing guard over the imperial capital of Cusco. And while its massive walls are still here, immovable after centuries of storms and earthquakes, its secrets remain buried in the same stone from which it was built. At first glance, Sacsayhuamán looks like a fortress. Its 3 tiers of zigzagging walls, each stretching hundreds of feet, rise like frozen waves of granite. The stones are gigantic, some weighing more than 120 tons, and they fit together so precisely that you can't slip a sheet of paper between them. There's no mortar, just perfect craftsmanship, the kind that makes modern engineers scratch their heads. How the Inca moved and shaped these megaliths with only stone tools, wooden levers, and human labor is one of the enduring puzzles of pre-Columbian architecture. Spanish chroniclers who arrived in the 16th century wrote of Sacsayhuamán as a royal citadel and the scene of fierce battles during the conquest. In 1536, the fortress was the site of a desperate stand by Manco Inca's forces against the Spaniards. The siege was brutal. When the Spanish finally took the walls, they dismantled much of the complex, hauling the smaller stones to Cusco to build colonial churches and houses. Only the largest blocks were left too big to move, which is why the zigzag walls remain today, like the backbone of some giant fossil. But the function of Sacsayhuamán goes deeper than military defense. Archaeologists now believe it was part of a ceremonial complex connected to the very heart of Inca cosmology. Cusco itself was designed in the shape of a puma, a sacred animal symbolizing strength and power, and Sacsayhuamán formed the puma's head. The zigzag walls may have represented the teeth, and the broad plaza below could have hosted thousands during festivals and rituals honoring the sun god Inti. The precision of the stonework suggests more than just practical necessity. Each block is uniquely shaped, some with as many as a dozen angles locking together, like pieces of an enormous three-dimensional puzzle. This polygonal masonry not only made the walls earthquake-resistant, it also gave them a sculptural, almost organic appearance. Some stones have small protrusions or indentations whose purpose remains unknown. Were they part of the construction process, decorative elements, or something symbolic we've yet to understand? Then there are the tunnels and chambers beneath the site, known locally as chincanas. These passageways twist through the bedrock, some leading to sealed-off rooms, others disappearing into darkness. Legends claim that these tunnels connect Sacsayhuamán directly to other sacred sites in Cusco, even to the Coricancha, the Inca temple of the sun. While no one has proven such an extensive underground network, explorers and treasure hunters have searched for it for centuries, with stories of people entering and never returning. The mystery extends to the site's origins. While most of what we see today is unquestionably Inca, some researchers speculate that the foundations may be far older, built by a culture predating the empire. The Inca were known to incorporate and expand upon earlier structures, and in some Andean sites, older, more weathered masonry lies beneath Inca additions. If this is the case at Sacsayhuamán, the true builders of the earliest walls are lost to history. From the site's highest point, the view over Cusco is breathtaking. You can see the red-tiled roofs, the grid of streets laid out by Spanish colonists, and beyond that, the green slopes of the surrounding mountains. It's easy to imagine the Inca elite standing here during the great festival of Inti Raymi, watching dancers, musicians, and priests fill the plaza below golden sun discs glinting in the highland light. And yet, for all the grandeur, there's a sense of loss. The Spanish dismantled so much of Sacsayhuamán that it's impossible to reconstruct exactly what it looked like in its prime. The absence of Inca written records means we rely on oral tradition archaeology and the often biased accounts of conquistadors to piece together its story. One of the most haunting details is how resistant the site has been to destruction. In the 1650 Cusco earthquake, colonial buildings crumbled, but the massive stones of Sacsayhuamán stayed locked in place. Modern seismic studies have confirmed that the interlocking stone shapes dissipate energy during tremors, making the structure extraordinarily stable. This wasn't luck, it was engineering genius. The zigzag walls also have an almost hypnotic effect when you walk alongside them. The pattern forces you to shift your perspective as you move, revealing and concealing the stones in a kind of rhythmic dance. It's not hard to believe that this was intentional, designed to impress visitors and perhaps even disorient enemies. The site's name adds another layer of intrigue. Sacsayhuamán is often translated as satisfied falcon or speckled head in Quechua, though some linguists think the meaning is more symbolic, tied to the city's puma shape. In Inca cosmology, animals weren't just symbols. They were living embodiments of cosmic forces. If Sacsayhuamán was the puma's head, it was more than a fortress. It was the spiritual and protective heart of the empire. Even today, Sacsayhuamán remains a place of gathering. Every June, the modern reenactment of Inti Raymi draws thousands of spectators to the plaza, where actors in elaborate Inca costume perform rituals to honor the sun. Drums echo against the stone dancers in feathered headdresses, move in patterns that mirror the zigzag walls, and the air smells faintly of incense. For a few hours, it feels as if the centuries collapse and you're standing in the living city again. But once the festival ends, the site returns to its quiet watch over Cusco. The wind sighs through the grass, and the stones, silent, unyielding, seem to hold their secrets a little tighter. Were these walls first raised for war or worship? Did their builders see them as the teeth of a puma, the fortress of a king, or the very bones of the earth? We can only guess, tracing our fingers along the cool, ancient surfaces, and wondering what stories the granite would tell if it could speak. In the eastern Mediterranean, under the warm turquoise waters off the coast of Alexandria, lies a city that legend once placed somewhere between myth and memory, Heracleion, also known by its Egyptian name, Thonis. For centuries, it was thought to be little more than a sailor's tale, a ghost port whispered about in Greek histories and Egyptian temple inscriptions. Then, in the year 2000, the sea gave it back. French maritime archaeologist Frank Gaudiot was surveying the Bay of Abukir when sonar images revealed the outlines of massive stone blocks scattered across the seabed. Divers descending into the greenish murk found colossal statues toppled in the sand, the remains of temple walls, and rows of inscribed stelae still standing as if they'd been left there yesterday. What they had found was the lost city itself, a once thriving hub of trade, religion, and diplomacy, preserved beneath 30 feet of water for over a millennium. Heracleion was no minor port. In the late Pharaonic period, it was Egypt's principal gateway to the Mediterranean, where Greek merchants, Egyptian officials, and travelers from across the ancient world converged. The city was built at the mouth of the Nile, where incoming ships could be taxed, goods could be inspected, and foreign envoys could be received with the grandeur befitting the pharaoh's authority. Its importance wasn't only economic, it was sacred. The city's great temple was dedicated to Amun-Gareb, a form of the god Amun, and served as a key religious site for both Egyptians and visiting Greeks. According to ancient historians like Herodotus, the temple was where the divine approval for Egypt's rulers was confirmed, and where great festivals honored the gods with processions along the city's canals. Heracleion was also associated with the legend of Heracles Hercules, from which its Greek name derives, and some myths claimed it was where Paris and Helen of Troy once sought refuge before the Trojan War. Walking through it, in its prime if you could, would have been a feast for the senses. Wooden ships creaking in the harbor, their hulls heavy with grain, papyrus wine, and olive oil. Merchants calling out prices in multiple languages. The smell of incense from the temple mixing with the salt of the sea. Statues of gods and kings towering over the quays, their reflections trembling in the water. And yet at some point, between the 2nd and 8th centuries A.D., the city vanished beneath the waves. The cause was a combination of geological and environmental factors. The Nile Delta rests on soft, waterlogged soils, prone to liquefaction, a process where the ground temporarily behaves like a liquid during earthquakes or under heavy flooding. Combined with rising sea levels and perhaps one or more catastrophic events, large parts of Heracleion simply sank. Buildings collapsed. Temples slid into the water. Within decades, the city was gone, its memory preserved only in fading texts. For over 1,000 years, the sea kept Heracleion hidden. Sand and silt covered its streets and courtyards, while fish and coral colonized the ruins. When divers first entered the site in 2000, they found colossal statues lying on their sides, some over 16 feet tall, carved from red granite and weighing several tons. Many were still astonishingly intact, their facial features and inscriptions clear despite centuries underwater. The finds also included dozens of small boats preserved in the silt, along with anchors, coins, and everyday objects like ceramic jars and jewelry. These artifacts paint a vivid picture of life in the city, bustling docks, religious processions, markets stocked with goods from across the ancient world. Some discoveries are uniquely revealing, like a massive stone slab covered in decrees regulating the harbor proof of the city's role in controlling Egypt's foreign trade. One of the most remarkable aspects of the site is its sheer size. Heracleion covered an area of roughly 4 square miles with wide canals functioning as watery streets. Archaeologists have mapped the foundations of temples, homes, and warehouses, as well as massive stone quays where ships once moored. The preservation of these features allows researchers to reconstruct not just isolated buildings, but an entire urban landscape frozen in time. Despite its rediscovery, Heracleion hasn't given up all its secrets. The precise sequence of events that led to its sinking is still debated. Was it a slow decline accelerated by gradual sea level rise, or was there a single cataclysmic disaster that tipped it into the sea? Some evidence points to sudden destruction, toppled columns, scattered temple blocks, and layers of debris that suggest violent upheaval. Others argue for a combination of long-term subsidence and periodic floods. The city's relationship with neighboring Canopus, another sunken settlement nearby, is also a focus of study. Together, these ports formed a vital part of Egypt's maritime network in the late Pharaonic and early Ptolemaic periods. The decline of one would have inevitably impacted the other, and understanding their interconnected histories could shed light on broader patterns of trade and political power in the Mediterranean. Diving in Heracleion today is like stepping into a dream where history and ocean life coexist. Shafts of light pierce the green water, illuminating statues of gods and kings lying in the sand. Schools of fish drift past the carved faces of pharaohs. The silence is broken only by the sound of your own breathing through the regulator. The effect is both awe-inspiring and eerie, like you've trespassed into a sacred space that the sea has claimed as its own. And there's a strange intimacy to the artifacts. A tiny gold amulet, a worn gaming piece, a jar still holding traces of ancient perfume. These are the things that make you realize Heracleion wasn't just a hub for kings and merchants. It was home to ordinary people who lived, worked, worshipped, and eventually fled as their city was swallowed. The rediscovery of Heracleion has rewritten a chapter of Egyptian history that was once thought lost forever. It confirms that the legends were rooted in fact, and it reminds us that even great cities can vanish, not because they were defeated in war or abandoned for new opportunities, but because the earth beneath them gave way. In a sense, Heracleion's fate is a warning. Coastal cities today face the same forces: rising seas, unstable ground, extreme weather that erase this ancient port. The difference is that we know it can happen because we've seen it before, lying quietly under the waves. For now, the city sleeps in its underwater tomb, its colossal statues standing guard over empty streets. Each diving season brings new finds, and each find raises new questions. What else lies buried in the silt? What stories have yet to be told? And will we, like the people of Heracleion, ever truly be ready for the moment when the ground beneath our feet begins to move?